The woman hadn't even stepped off the stagecoach before Margaret Holloway opened her mouth. Good Lord! Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd gathered outside Dunmore's general store, her voice carrying the way mean voices always do, sharp, deliberate, designed to land. That is what Caleb Rourke sent away for? Clara Whitmore stood in the snow with her carpetbag hanging from one hand and her chin lifted exactly 1 degree higher than anyone expected from a woman dressed the way she was dressed. Her coat had a tear along the left shoulder. Her boots were wrong for the weather. The dress beneath, the one she'd clearly worn for this occasion, the one she'd chosen to make a good impression, was patched at both elbows and faded to a color that might have once been blue. Margaret laughed, and 2 or 3 women beside her laughed too, because that is what women like that do. Caleb heard it. He was standing 10 feet away, and he heard every word. What he did next, or more accurately, what he failed to do, would cost him everything. Oh, before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if something in this moves you, leave a like. It means more than you know. Now, let's go back to Christmas Eve, 1887, and meet the man who almost let his pride destroy the best thing that ever walked into his life. The stage from Cheyenne was already 2 hours late when Caleb Rourke finally stopped pretending he wasn't watching the road. He'd been standing beside the water trough outside Dunmore's for long enough that his breath had fogged and cleared and fogged again, and his fingers inside his gloves had gone from cold to numb to something past numb that he didn't have a name for. The sky was the color of an old tin plate. Snow was falling the way it always fell in Wyoming in December. Not gently, not like anything in a painting, but sideways and mean and personal, like it had something against you specifically. He told himself he wasn't nervous. He was, of course. He was so nervous he'd forgotten to eat breakfast that morning, which Elsie had noticed immediately because Elsie noticed everything. You didn't eat your porridge, she'd told him at the kitchen table, watching him with those wide brown eyes that were too serious for a 6-year-old. Wasn't hungry. You're always hungry. Elsie. Papa, you're always hungry. You ate 4 biscuits yesterday and you said that wasn't even enough. He hadn't answered that. He'd put on his coat and his hat and told her to stay with the Halverson woman next door and he'd be back before supper. Elsie had stood in the doorway of the cabin with her arms crossed and her expression exactly like her mother's, that particular look that said she knew something you weren't saying out loud, and watched him hitch the wagon without another word. That had been worse than if she'd argued with him. The thing was, Caleb hadn't expected to feel this way. When he'd first written the letter, and it had taken him 4 attempts to write a letter that sounded like something a reasonable adult human being would write, he'd told himself it was a practical arrangement. The homestead needed help. Elsie needed a woman's presence. He was 34 years old and capable of honesty with himself, and the honest truth was that he could not keep doing this alone. The winters were too long, the work too much, the silence inside that cabin after Elsie went to sleep at night too heavy to keep carrying by himself. He was not looking for love. He was not even sure he remembered what that felt like anymore. 2 years since Ruth had died. 2 years since the fever had taken her in 4 days, which was not enough time to say the things he should have said, which he supposed was always the way with these things, but that didn't make it any easier to live with. 2 years since he'd watched Elsie stand at the grave and not cry, because she was too young to understand yet that crying was allowed, that it wasn't weakness, that sometimes a person needed to just fall apart and let someone else hold the pieces for a while. Neither of them had learned that lesson particularly well. So he'd answered an advertisement in the Missouri papers. Widower, 34, Wyoming Territory. Homestead. Daughter, age 6. Seeking capable woman of honest character for marriage. No pretenses offered or expected. He'd written it that way on purpose. No pretenses. He wasn't going to promise what he couldn't give. The reply had come 3 weeks later in an envelope with careful handwriting that looked like someone who'd been educated, actually educated, not just taught to write her name. Clara Whitmore, age 28, formerly of Jefferson City, Missouri. School teacher. No family remaining. She'd stated her situation plainly. She had modest means but good health and a willingness to work. She asked 3 questions about Elsie: her age, her temperament, what she liked to do, and 1 question about him. What does your daughter need most right now? He'd stared at that question for a long time before he answered. Stability, he'd written finally. And someone who won't leave. She'd written back within a week. She'd said she understood. She'd said she wasn't the kind of woman who left. They'd exchanged 5 more letters over the following month. She wrote the way she talked, he suspected, direct, without excess decoration, with occasional dry humor that surprised him enough that he'd laughed once at the kitchen table and then looked up quickly to make sure Elsie hadn't seen. He wasn't ready for Elsie to see him laugh about anything yet. It felt disloyal somehow. He knew that wasn't rational. He did it anyway. He'd sent money for the stage ticket in October. She was supposed to arrive the second week of December. Then the pass closed early, and the stage was rerouted and delayed again, and by the time the telegram came saying she'd arrive Christmas Eve, Caleb had spent 2 weeks convincing himself this was a mistake, then convincing himself it wasn't, then convincing himself he had no business making these kinds of decisions for another person's life. I was still in the middle of that last argument with himself when he heard the bells. The stage came around the bend with its horses blowing hard and its wheels throwing up a spray of ice and packed snow, and Caleb felt his stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with the sudden terrifying reality that there was a person on that coach who had sold everything she owned and traveled across 2 states to marry a man she'd never met, and that man was him, and he was standing here with numb fingers and an empty stomach and absolutely no idea what he was going to say. The coach stopped. The driver climbed down. The door swung open. And Margaret Holloway, who had come to collect a package from the general store and had apparently decided this was entertainment worth delaying for, opened her mouth. Good Lord, that is what Caleb Rourke sent away for? The laughter was quiet, but it wasn't quiet enough. And Caleb stood there and heard it and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the weather, and he didn't move. He would think about that moment for a long time afterward. The moment when he should have stepped forward, when he should have walked directly to Clara Whitmore, who was standing in the snow with her carpet bag and her lifted chin and her patched coat, and said something, anything, his name at minimum. I'm Caleb. I'm glad you made it. Instead, he stood there. And Clara, because she was Clara, because she had apparently come into the world with a spine made of something sturdier than what most people were issued at birth, turned toward the sound of the laughter and looked directly at the women making it, for exactly 2 seconds, without expression. Just looked. Then she turned away as if they were a fence post she'd noted and moved on from, and began scanning the small crowd with quiet, careful attention. Her eyes found Caleb. He knew she'd found him because something in her expression shifted, just slightly, a small settling, like a person who has been holding their breath for a long time and finally allows themselves to exhale. He walked toward her. Too late and too slow. But he walked. Miss Whitmore. Mr. Rourke. Her voice was steadier than his. She had a smear of road dust on her left cheekbone, and the cold had turned her nose red, and she was not what he'd pictured, though he realized he hadn't let himself picture anything concrete because picturing it made it too real. She was taller than he expected, with dark eyes that were currently doing a thorough and unashamed assessment of him in the way that he probably should have found rude, but found instead, strangely, a relief. At least she wasn't pretending either. You made it, he said, because he couldn't think of anything better. Eventually, she said. Behind him, Margaret Holloway said something to the woman beside her. Clara heard it. He could tell she heard it by the slight tightening around her eyes. But she didn't look again. She kept her attention on him. Is there somewhere to put this? She lifted the carpet bag slightly. It's heavier than it looks. He took it from her. It wasn't, actually. It was light enough that it nearly embarrassed him because it meant there wasn't much in it, and that meant he didn't finish that thought. He just gestured toward the wagon. They walked past Margaret Holloway and her companions without stopping. Caleb kept his eyes forward. Clara walked beside him with her chin still at that particular angle, and he noticed that her steps were steady despite the slick ground and the cold, like a person who had learned not to let uncertain footing show in her face. He helped her up to the wagon bench. She thanked him with a small nod, practical, no performance to it. He climbed up beside her and took the reins and turned the horses toward home, and for the first quarter mile neither of them said anything, because what was there to say, really? They were strangers who were now married. The papers had been filed 2 weeks ago by proxy, at Clara's suggestion, because she said she didn't want either of them traveling on uncertainty. He'd agreed to it without fully thinking through what it would feel like to be legally bound to someone he'd never seen. It felt strange. Obviously, it felt strange. He kept his eyes on the road. "Your daughter," Clara said finally. "Elsie. Is she at the house?" "With a neighbor. I'll collect her on the way." Clara nodded. Then, "What did you tell her?" "About me." He thought about lying. He wasn't sure why. He wasn't a man who lied habitually, but he considered it, which told him something about how off balance he was. "I told her a woman was coming to stay with us, that she'd be living with us from now on." A pause. "You didn't tell her I was your wife." I told her you'd be part of the family, that she should be welcoming. But not that I was your wife." He made himself look at her then. She was watching the road too, her hands folded in her lap, her expression entirely neutral in a way that he suspected took effort. "I didn't want to—" He stopped, started again. "She lost her mother 2 years ago. I didn't want to use a word that might confuse her," Clara said. Not accusing, just completing the sentence for him. "Yes." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right. I understand that." And she said it in a tone that suggested she actually did. Not that she was being polite about accepting something she disagreed with, which he hadn't expected that either. He'd expected, he realized, some form of wounded pride. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he'd been worried about it. They rode another half-mile. Snow was falling heavier now, the kind that muffled sound and made the world feel smaller than it was. "Mr. Rourke," Clara said. "Caleb." She accepted that with a small dip of her chin. "Caleb, I want to say something, and I'd appreciate it if you'd just let me finish before you respond." He nodded. "I know what this looks like. I know what those women back there thought, and I know what you probably thought when you saw me step off that coach. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because that's not how I operate." She kept her eyes forward. Her voice was even, but he could hear something working underneath it, something controlled and deliberate. "I had more than this once. I'm not going to go into all of it right now, but I want you to know that I didn't come here because I had no other choices. I came here because the choices I had left were smaller than this one, and I'd rather build something than manage a slow disappearing act." She glanced at him then, briefly. "I am a good teacher. I work hard. I don't complain about things I can't change. And I meant what I said in my letters. I'm not the kind of woman who leaves." A pause. "That's all." Caleb kept his eyes on the horses for a long moment. "The carpet bag," he said finally. She waited. "Is that everything you brought?" She considered whether to answer that honestly. He could see her considering it. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. He thought about saying something about it and decided not to, because there wasn't a thing he could say that wouldn't come out either condescending or hollow. So instead he said, "The Halverson place is just ahead. We'll get Elsie." Clara straightened slightly, and he noticed for the first time that her hands in her lap were shaking. Not from cold, or not only from cold, but from something that looked a great deal like a person bracing for the most important moment of a very long, very hard journey. The wagon pulled up outside the Halverson house. Before Caleb could climb down, the front door burst open and Elsie came through it like she'd been fired from a cannon, hair escaping from both braids, coat half on, one boot not properly laced, and she stopped dead at the edge of the porch when she saw the woman sitting in the wagon. Elsie stared. Clara stared back. And in the way that small children sometimes operate with a directness that adults have entirely lost access to, Elsie said, without preamble or introduction, "Are you cold?" Clara blinked. Then, and Caleb saw this, he was watching, something in her face let go of something it had been holding. "Yes," she said honestly, "quite cold." "I have mittens," Elsie said. "They'd probably be too small, but you could try them." "Elsie," Caleb started. "That is very kind," Clara said. And she said it to Elsie the way you say something real to another person, not the way adults usually talk to children, with that particular layer of performance that children always detect. She said it like Elsie had offered something genuinely valuable. "Can I see them?" Elsie looked down at her own hands. She was wearing mittens, red ones, a little worn at the right thumb. She pulled off the left one without hesitation and held it out. Clara leaned from the wagon bench and accepted it. She held it up, examined it seriously, then attempted to pull it onto her right hand. It made it to the second knuckle before stopping. Elsie burst into laughter. Caleb hadn't heard that laugh, that full, unguarded, helpless laugh, in longer than he could account for. It stopped him somewhere in his chest like a hand pressed flat against a door. Clara looked at the mitten stuck on her fingers, and then at Elsie and said, perfectly seriously, "I think my hand is slightly too large." Elsie laughed harder. "It's a lot too large," she managed. "That's a 6-year-old hand." "I see. My mistake." She pulled the mitten free and handed it back. Elsie climbed down from the porch and crossed to the wagon, and before Caleb could move to help her up, she was already climbing, the way she always climbed things. Determined and slightly reckless, not asking for assistance, and she settled herself on the bench between the two adults and looked from one to the other with those serious eyes. "You can sit in the middle if you want," she told Clara. "The wind doesn't get to the middle as much." "I'm fine here," Clara said. "But thank you." Elsie seemed to accept this. She looked up at her father. He looked down at her. She gave him a small, firm nod, the way a person nods when they've made up their mind about something. And he had absolutely no idea what to do with that, so he just clicked the horses forward and drove them home through the thickening snow. The cabin was cold when they arrived. He hadn't banked the fire properly before he left, because his mind had been somewhere else. Out on the road, somewhere on a stagecoach coming in from Cheyenne. He got it going again while Elsie showed Clara where things were with the proprietorial confidence of a child who takes the responsibility of tour guide very seriously. "That's where we eat," Elsie said, pointing at the table. "Papa burns breakfast sometimes, but not always. That's where I sleep." She pointed at the small curtained alcove. "Papa sleeps there." "The loft." "That cupboard sticks unless you push on the left side first. Don't just pull. It won't open." Clara moved through the cabin quietly, taking it in. He watched her. He couldn't help watching her. And he tried to see it through her eyes. The rough walls. The practical, unadorned furniture. The place where Ruth had taken down a shelf she didn't like, and he'd never gotten around to putting anything back there. The braided rug that was starting to fray at one edge. The window that needed recaulking. It was a hard place. He'd always known that. He just hadn't had to see it freshly in a while. Clara stopped in front of the shelf where Elsie kept her few things. A smooth stone, a feather, a small tin of buttons she'd collected, and in the center, a little ceramic cup with a chip taken out of the rim. She looked at it without touching it. "That was my mama's cup," Elsie said from directly beside her, because Elsie had been following her through the cabin like a small, serious shadow. "We kept it because it smells like her still. Papa says it probably doesn't anymore, but I think it does." Clara didn't say the wrong thing. She didn't say how sweet or, "Oh, you must miss her," or any of the things adults usually said when children showed them something that mattered. She just looked at the cup and said, "Then it probably does." Elsie considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Do you want to smell it?" "Only if you want me to." Elsie thought about it. She picked up the cup, very carefully, with both hands, and held it out. Clara leaned in. She stayed there for just a moment. Then she straightened. "Lavender," she said quietly, "and something warm. Bread, maybe." Elsie looked at her with an expression that Caleb could not quite read. Not quite surprise, not quite relief, something between them. "Yes," she said softly. "She made bread on Sundays." The fire caught. The cabin began, slowly, to warm. Caleb stood at the stove and stared at the flames and listened to his daughter talk to the stranger who was now his wife, and he felt something complicated happening in the region behind his ribs, something he was not ready to name and was not going to name, not tonight, not yet. But it was there, whatever it was. Already, it was there. He heard Elsie laugh again, and the sound of it moved through the cabin the way warmth does, gradually, filling the corners last. Outside, the Wyoming winter pressed against the glass. Inside, something, small and cautious and not yet trusted, but real, had just, without asking permission, decided to stay. The morning after Clara arrived, Caleb woke before dawn the way he always did, which was not gently. He came out of sleep the same way he did most things, abruptly, fully, like a man who'd trained himself not to linger in the space between dreaming and waking because nothing good ever lived there. He lay in the loft for a moment and stared at the ceiling and listened to the cabin. Wind outside. The pop and settle of the wood stove he'd loaded before bed. And then, underneath those familiar sounds, something else. A sound that didn't belong. Someone was already up. He pulled on his pants and his boots and climbed down the ladder in his socks, moving quiet the way you move when you're not sure what you're walking into. The curtain to Elsie's alcove was still pulled shut. The loft was empty and cold and dark. But the kitchen had a lamp burning low, and Clara was standing at the stove with her back to him, doing something with the cast iron skillet that involved a considerable amount of concentration. She didn't hear him come down. Or she heard him and didn't react, which he suspected might actually be more likely. He stood at the bottom of the ladder for a moment and tried to figure out what to do with himself. This was his kitchen. He'd stood in it 10,000 times. He knew exactly where the floorboards creaked and which drawer stuck, and how long the stove took to get proper heat going in winter. None of that information was useful to him right now, because he was suddenly and inexplicably uncertain how to simply walk across a room. "There's coffee," Clara said, without turning around. He crossed the room and poured himself a cup. It was good coffee, better than his, which he made too strong out of long habit. He stood beside the stove because that was where the warmth was. "You didn't have to," he started. "I was awake anyway." She shifted the skillet. "I don't sleep well in new places. Never have." He looked at the back of her head and thought about the fact that she'd slept on the floor last night, on the pallet he'd made up near the stove, because there was only the one real bed in the loft, and he'd offered to sleep in the barn, and she'd refused that with a firmness that didn't invite negotiation. And so they'd arrived at the pallet arrangement, which neither of them had commented on beyond the logistics of it. "I'll build another room," he said, "off the east side. It'll take a few weeks, but the lumber's—" "Caleb." She said his name the way she'd said it in the wagon the night before. Not sharp, not impatient, just direct. "The pallet is fine." "It's not fine. It's warmer than where I slept for the last 6 months of my life, so to me it is fine." He didn't know what to say to that. So he drank his coffee and she finished with the skillet, and they stood in the kitchen together in a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people who were still figuring out the shape of things. Elsie appeared from behind her curtain at her usual hour, which was a specific and reliable 20 minutes after first light. Not a minute before, not a minute after. She stopped in the kitchen doorway with her hair a disaster and her feet bare on the cold floor, and looked at the scene with the alert assessment of a small person who has woken up to a situation that requires evaluation. "You made breakfast," she said to Clara. "I did." "Papa burns breakfast." "I know," Clara said. "He mentioned." Caleb opened his mouth. "I said I sometimes—" "It was in one of the letters," Clara said, and there was the dry humor again. The same thing he'd noticed in her writing, and it was stranger and more disarming in person than it had been on the page. "Don't worry, I'm not keeping score." Elsie pulled out her chair and sat down with the confidence of someone who'd assessed the situation and decided it was acceptable. Clara set a plate in front of her, eggs, and what appeared to be pan-fried cornmeal with something in it, dried fruit of some kind. He wasn't sure where she'd found it, probably the back of the cupboard where things went to be forgotten. Elsie looked at the plate. "What's in it?" "Dried apple. And a little cinnamon." "We have cinnamon?" "You do." "It was behind the flour." Elsie picked up her fork and tried it with the careful seriousness she applied to most things. Then she tried it again less carefully, which was as close to enthusiasm as Elsie Rourke generally got before 8 in the morning. Caleb sat down and ate what Clara put in front of him without commentary, because it was good, and because he had a feeling that if he made too much of it, she'd get self-conscious about it, or he would, or something would tip into a register that neither of them was ready for. That was how the first morning went. The first week went roughly the same way. Carefully, practically, with both of them navigating around each other with the particular attention of people who are aware they're on uncertain ground. Clara did not try to rearrange things. She did not make suggestions about how the cabin was organized or what Caleb's systems were or weren't. She watched first, which he noticed, and figured out how things worked, and then found the places where she could be useful without stepping on anything that wasn't hers to step on. The first thing she fixed was a shirt of Elsie's that had a tear along the collar. She did it one evening while Elsie was doing the small amount of schoolwork Caleb tried to keep up with. Letters, numbers, the basic geography he'd been attempting from a battered almanac. And she did it without making a production of it, just sat by the lamp with a needle and thread and fixed it so carefully that when Elsie put it on the next morning, she didn't notice it had ever been damaged. Caleb noticed. He didn't say anything. The second thing she did was Elsie's buttons. Elsie had been buttoning her own coat for the better part of a year, insisting on it with the ferocity that 6-year-olds bring to assertions of independence. But she always missed one somewhere in the middle and ended up with the whole thing crooked and one side longer than the other. Clara watched this happen 2 mornings in a row without intervening. On the third morning, she said to Elsie, "Can I show you something?" Elsie, suspicious, said, "What?" "A way to do the buttons so they come out even every time." Elsie crossed her arms. "I know how to do buttons." "I know you do. This is a different way. You don't have to use it." A pause. "What way?" "You start from the bottom one first, match it to the bottom hole, then work up." Elsie looked at her coat. She'd started as usual from the top. She looked back at Clara. "Why does that work better?" "Because the bottom hole doesn't move. The top ones shift depending on how you're standing." Elsie considered this with genuine seriousness, the way she considered most things. Then she unbuttoned her coat and started again from the bottom. When she was done, she looked down at herself. The coat was straight. She didn't say anything, but she did it from the bottom every morning after that. These were small things. Caleb knew they were small things. He also knew, in the quiet part of himself, that he wasn't examining too closely, that small things were the actual fabric of a life, that most of a person's existence was not made up of the dramatic moments, but of the 1,000 ordinary ones that nobody wrote down or remembered, except by their accumulated weight. He knew this because Ruth had been good at small things too, and he felt the ghost of that knowledge now in ways that made him want to be somewhere else. He wasn't being fair to Clara. He knew he wasn't being fair to Clara. He was polite. He was decent. He worked beside her. He answered her questions about the homestead and the animals and the land, honestly and with enough detail that she could actually learn what she was asking. But he kept a distance, a specific calculated distance, not large enough to be rude, not small enough to be anything else. Clara didn't call him on it, which somehow made it worse. She taught Elsie to read. Not from the beginning. Elsie had letters, had some words. Caleb had managed that much. But Clara sat with her every afternoon for an hour, and they worked through the almanac and a small shelf of books that Clara had packed in her carpet bag, which turned out to be almost entirely composed of books and very little else, which explained both the weight he'd expected and the lightness he'd found. "You packed books instead of clothes," he said one evening. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. Clara looked up from the mending she'd been doing, one of his shirts this time, without asking, which he supposed they'd have to talk about, but also he'd been wearing that shirt with the loose third button for 4 months, and she'd fixed it in 20 minutes. "The clothes I had weren't worth packing," she said simply. "The books were." He wanted to ask more. He didn't ask more. But 2 nights later, when Elsie was asleep and the fire had burned low, and he was cleaning his rifle at the table, and Clara was reading one of her books, something he couldn't see the title of, he said, without looking up from the barrel, "You were a teacher." "Yes." "For how long?" She turned a page. 6 years, since I was 22. "You liked it?" It wasn't quite a question. She seemed to hear that. "Yes," she said, and something in her voice shifted just slightly, like a door opening an inch. "I liked it very much." "What happened?" The page didn't turn for a moment. "My father died 2 years ago. He had debts I didn't know about. From before my mother died. He'd managed them for a long time, I think, just moving things around. And then he couldn't anymore. And then he was gone." She said it flatly, not performing grief, just reporting facts. "I sold the house. I sold the furniture. I sold everything that would sell. It wasn't enough. But it was enough that the bank let the rest go." A pause. "I lost the teaching position because the school board decided an unmarried woman without family connections in the county was a liability. That was the word they used. Liability." Caleb set down the rifle barrel. "They can do that?" "They did it." She turned the page now. "I had 3 months of money left and no prospects in Jefferson City, and an advertisement in a Missouri paper from a widowed rancher in Wyoming who said he wanted no pretenses." She glanced at him then, briefly. "I appreciated the honesty of that." He looked at the rifle in his hands. He was suddenly aware that he'd been holding it this whole conversation without actually cleaning anything. He set it down on the cloth and picked up the rod. "I'm sorry," he said. "About your father." 2 years ago, she said. For both of us, as it turns out. He hadn't thought about that. He should have. He'd done the arithmetic when her letters arrived, but he hadn't let himself sit with it, the coincidence or the parallel or whatever it was. Both of them, 2 years ago. Both of them, 2 years of figuring out how to keep going after the thing that organized your world simply stopped. "Yeah," he said after a moment. 2 years ago. She went back to her book. He went back to the rifle. The fire settled and the snow moved outside, and somewhere in the rafters something small and alive shifted in the cold. He did not make her a carved flower that night. He'd had a piece of basswood he'd been working on. He'd had it since October, before she arrived, a habit from years ago he'd fallen back into when his hands needed something to do in the evenings, and his mind needed to be somewhere specific. He'd started carving without a clear intention of what it would become, which was how it usually worked for him. It had started becoming a flower about a week ago. He'd noticed it, and then he'd set it in the back of the drawer and thought about that. The flower stayed in the drawer. There were things that happened that second week that he allowed himself to notice and did not allow himself to do anything about. The way Clara's laugh sounded when Elsie said something that surprised her. Not polite, not performed. A real laugh that seemed to catch her slightly off guard, as if she hadn't expected to find something funny and was briefly annoyed that she had. The way she handled the animals, cautious at first, respectful, watching how they behaved before deciding how to approach, which told him she'd had some experience but not a lot, and that she learned by watching rather than by doing things wrong. The way she moved through the cabin after the first week, not tentative anymore, not uncertain, but not presumptuous either, occupying exactly as much space as she needed and not more. He found himself looking for things to criticize. It disturbed him, that impulse. He wasn't proud of it. He looked for the shortcuts, the things she'd gloss over, the places where competence would turn out to be performance. Because he'd built, in the 2 years since Ruth, a very reliable internal argument for why he should not care about anyone, which went roughly. People leave or people die, and the result is the same, which is that you are standing alone in a cold kitchen at 5 a.m, wondering how you got here. The argument required proof. He kept looking for it, and instead he got the afternoon he came in from the barn and found Clara at the kitchen table helping Elsie with an arithmetic problem, and Elsie was frustrated, the kind of frustrated that tipped toward tears in small children, and Clara didn't panic and didn't overcomfort and didn't tell Elsie it was fine when it clearly wasn't fine to Elsie. She said, "All right, forget the problem. Tell me what 2 plus 2 is." Elsie said 4 furiously. Clara said, "And what's 4 plus 4? 8, Elsie said, still furious. "And what's 8 plus 6? Elsie started to say she didn't know, and then stopped and counted something on her fingers and said, 14. "Right," Clara said. "Look at the problem again." Elsie looked at the problem. Something happened in her face. She wrote the answer. She was right. "I did it," Elsie said. "You did," Clara said. "Not I knew you could or see how smart you are. Just you did, acknowledging the fact of it, and then moving to the next problem." Caleb stood in the doorway with mud on his boots and cold in his coat, and he stood there for a full 30 seconds before either of them noticed him. The thing in the drawer was starting to bother him. He took it out 3 nights later and looked at it in the lamplight. It was going to be a flower. It was already mostly a flower, the petals roughed out, the center coming together. He didn't know what kind. Something prairie adjacent, something he'd seen growing in the fields when he was younger. His mother had liked wildflowers. Ruth had liked wildflowers. He wasn't sure if that meant something or not. He put it back in the drawer and went to bed and lay in the loft staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind for what felt like a long time before his brain finally got tired enough to let him sleep. 2 weeks and 3 days after Clara arrived, he came in from checking the east fence, which had a post that kept working loose no matter how many times he reset it, a problem that had been going on since September and at this point felt personal. And he found Clara in the bedroom alcove, Elsie's alcove, and Elsie was crying. Not the frustrated arithmetic tears. Crying properly, the way children cry when something has gotten past all their defenses, the kind that sounds like it starts somewhere deeper than the throat. He stopped in the doorway. Clara was sitting on the edge of Elsie's bed with her hand on Elsie's back, not rubbing circles, just resting there, a weight, a presence, and saying nothing at all, which was, Caleb recognized with a jolt, exactly the right thing to do. Elsie cried in the way she never let herself cry in front of him, which was to say completely, without managing it, without being brave about it, letting it be as large as it was. He should have gone back outside. He knew he should have gone back outside. Let this be what it was. Let Clara handle it, which she was clearly doing, which she was doing better than he would have because he froze every time Elsie cried in front of him, had frozen every time since Ruth died, because seeing Elsie cry made him feel as if the ground under his feet was not solid. He didn't go back outside. He stood in the cabin doorway with the cold coming in past him, and he watched his daughter cry in a way she apparently needed to cry, with a woman she'd known less than 3 weeks, and he felt something in his chest do something he could not name and did not try to. Clara looked up and saw him. She didn't signal him to leave, didn't signal him to come in. She just looked at him for a moment with her hand still on Elsie's back, and then she looked back at Elsie, and Caleb quietly pulled the door shut and went back out to the fence post. He hit it harder than he needed to with the post driver. The sound went out across the empty flat white land and came back from nowhere. That evening, after Elsie had gone to sleep, he asked, "What was it?" Clara was at the stove. She turned slightly. She found the cup. What cup? Ruth's cup. The ceramic one. She'd been keeping it on the shelf, but it had been moved. I think she moved it herself by accident when she was getting her button tin. And she was looking for it. She panicked. A pause. She thought it was gone. He stood very still. "I found it," Clara said. "It had rolled behind the almanac. We put it back." She turned back to the stove. She cried because she thought it was gone. When she knew it wasn't, she kept crying for a while anyway. I think she needed to. He sat down at the table and put his hands flat on the wood and looked at them. "She doesn't cry in front of me," he said. Not an accusation, just a fact that was sitting in his mouth wanting to be out of it. "I know." Clara turned the heat down on whatever was on the stove. "I think she's protecting you." He looked up. "She's 6, Clara said, not unkindly, "but she's been watching you for 2 years. She knows you go somewhere else when you're hurting. She doesn't want to send you there." He opened his mouth and didn't know what was going to come out, and so closed it again. Clara brought 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him and sat down across the table, which was the closest she'd sat to him since the wagon ride 3 weeks ago. She wrapped her hands around her cup and looked at the surface of it. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel bad," she said quietly. "I'm telling you because she needs to know you can handle it. That's all. She needs to know that if she falls apart, you won't go somewhere she can't find you." Caleb looked at the far wall for a long time, the wind outside, the stove ticking as it cooled slightly, his coffee getting cold in his hands. "I didn't know she was doing that," he said. "I know you didn't." "She's better than I deserve." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think you're harder on yourself than is strictly accurate." "I sat in that barn for 2 days after Ruth died," he said. He hadn't told anyone this. He wasn't sure why he was telling her, maybe because the telling had been building up somewhere for 2 years and it had to come out somewhere. "Elsie was with the Halversons. I sat in the barn for 2 days because I didn't know how to go back into that house. I kept thinking that if I didn't go in, it wouldn't be real yet." He looked at his cup. "Then on the 3rd day, Elsie was standing at the barn door asking if I was coming in to make breakfast." Clara said nothing. She just listened, which he was beginning to understand was one of the things she did, the real things, not the performative kind of listening, but the actual kind. "She was 4 years old," he said. "She was asking me about breakfast, and He stopped. Started again. "I went in and made breakfast." "Yes," Clara said, quietly, like someone who understood exactly what that sentence contained. "I went in and made breakfast. The whole broken, inadequate, sufficient miracle of it." They sat at that table for another half hour and didn't talk much more, and it was all right. It wasn't comfortable in the way that comfortable things are easy. It was something else, something slightly harder than comfortable, like a muscle that's been worked for the first time and aches in a way that is also proof that it's getting stronger. He noticed, when he finally pushed back his chair to go up to the loft, that she'd mended the torn hem on her own dress at some point in the last few days. Not replaced it, not patched it with something new. She'd carefully, invisibly, repaired the original material so that you'd have to look closely to see it had ever been damaged. He stood by the ladder and looked at the hem and thought about what it meant to care for the things you had left. Not because they were beautiful or new, but simply because they were yours and they were worth maintaining. He went up to the loft. He lay in the dark. He thought about the flower in the drawer and whether it was finished and what it was for. In the morning, he got up early again. Clara was already at the stove again. He poured his coffee and stood beside the stove in his socks and didn't feel uncertain about where he was standing. "The east fence post," he said. "I need to re-pour the base before it freezes again. It's going to take most of the day." "All right. If you—" He stopped, started again. "Elsie mentioned she wanted to try making bread. I don't know if that's something you'd want to—" "I'll show her," Clara said. "She didn't make it into anything more than what it was. We'll save you some." He finished his coffee and pulled on his coat and his hat and his gloves and went out into the cold. And just before he got to the barn, he realized he was walking differently than he had been 3 weeks ago. Not better necessarily, just differently. Like a man who still doesn't know where he's going but has stopped pretending the not knowing doesn't matter. The fence post took most of the morning and all of his attention, which was what he needed. Physical work had always been where he put the things he couldn't think straight about. In his hands, in his back, in the resistance of material against effort. The post went in solid and he mixed the base with hands that were cold through his gloves and packed it and stamped it down and stood back and looked at it with the satisfaction of something done properly. He ate lunch in the barn because his hands were too dirty to bring inside, dried venison and a heel of yesterday's bread he'd thought to pocket before he left. He sat on a hay bale and listened to the horses shift and breathe and thought about nothing in particular, which was a state he hadn't been able to achieve in a long time. When he came in late afternoon, the cabin smelled like bread. Real bread, not his bread, which was serviceable and dense and worked as food without doing anything more than that. This smelled like something else. He stood in the doorway, and the smell hit him somewhere pre-rational, somewhere below language, and he had to stand there for a second before he could walk in normally. Elsie was sitting at the table with flour on her nose and her forearms, and one streak of it across her forehead in a way that suggested she'd pushed her hair back at some point with both hands full of dough. She was intensely proud of herself. This was evident from the way she sat, which was the posture of a person containing great news. "We made bread," she announced. "I can see that." "And smell it," Elsie corrected. "Yes. Clara showed me about kneading. You have to do it until your arms hurt or it doesn't work right." "Is that so?" "My arms don't hurt," Elsie added, "because I'm strong, but they're a little tired." Clara was washing her hands at the basin, back turned, and Caleb could see from the set of her shoulders that she was trying not to smile at this characterization, which she was managing with some effort. Elsie cut him a piece before supper with the ceremony of a person bestowing something significant. He ate it at the table, and it was honestly the best bread he'd eaten in 2 years. He didn't say so because he wasn't sure his voice would be entirely steady if he tried to say it out loud, for reasons that had nothing to do with the bread and everything to do with the shape of this room right now. His daughter with flour on her nose, this woman at the basin, the smell of something warm, the window going dark outside with the Wyoming cold pressing against it and not getting in. "Well?" Elsie demanded. "Good bread," he said. Elsie looked at Clara. Clara looked at Elsie. Something passed between them, some compact of shared amusement at his restraint, and Elsie said very seriously, "He means it's very good. He just doesn't say very good." "I gathered that," Clara said. He ate a second piece without being asked, which settled the matter. That night he took the carving out of the drawer after both of them were asleep. He worked on it by lamplight for an hour, not rushing it, just finding what was already in the wood. The flower was almost done. The petals had a particular curl to them that he hadn't planned, that had emerged from following the grain, and it looked like something real, like something you'd find growing in a field and stop to look at because it was small and precise and had managed to exist in a landscape that was not especially hospitable to small, precise things. He set it on the table beside his lamp and looked at it. Then he put it back in the drawer, not because he'd changed his mind, but because he hadn't yet figured out what he was saying by giving it. He needed to know what he was saying. He had a sense it was more than he was ready to say out loud, and he wanted to be sure of that before he did anything he couldn't take back. He went to bed. Downstairs near the stove, on the pallet that was not a permanent solution, and both of them knew it, Clara Whitmore lay awake in the dark and listened to the sound of the Wyoming wind and thought about the things she'd left in Missouri, The debts, the empty house, the position she'd earned and lost, the version of herself that had believed her life would look different than this. She thought about those things the way you think about them when you've reached an uneasy peace with them, aware of them, seeing them clearly, not trying to make them smaller or larger than they were. She thought about a man who'd sat in a barn for 2 days and then made his daughter breakfast and never mentioned it to anyone. She thought about a 6-year-old who was protecting a grown man from her grief. She thought about flour on small forearms and a ceramic cup that smelled like Sunday bread, and the particular quality of a silence that was, whatever else it was, honest. Outside, the wind moved across the flat land, and the snow that had fallen was hard and still. And the stars, when the clouds broke, were the same stars that had been above Wyoming for a very long time, patient, indifferent, present. Clara pulled the blanket closer and let her eyes close and did not, for the first time since Jefferson City, feel entirely alone. It was not yet enough to build a life on. But it was, she thought, something. And something, in her experience, was where everything that mattered had always started. The 3rd week of January brought a cold that was different from the December cold, older somehow, more settled into itself, the kind that stopped being dramatic and just became the permanent condition of the world. The thermometer outside the cabin door read things that Caleb had stopped telling Clara about because there was no useful information in the number. It was cold. Everything was cold. The horses needed extra feed, the water trough needed breaking every morning, and the east fence post that he'd repoured with such satisfaction in December had heaved slightly in the freeze-thaw cycle and was going to need attention again in spring. Some problems, he'd learned, were not solved so much as managed across a lifetime. I was thinking about the fence post when he hitched the wagon for the supply run into Dunmore. He hadn't been to town in 3 weeks, longer than usual, and he knew why, though he hadn't said it to himself plainly until this morning. He'd been staying close to the homestead. He told himself it was the weather, which was partially true. He told himself it was the work, which was also partially true. The rest of it was that the cabin had started to feel like something worth coming home to, and he was not entirely sure what to do with that. Clara came to the door while he was checking the harness. "I can write a list," she said, "if there are things we need." "Already have one." She leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed against the cold, wearing the wool shawl she'd taken to using over her coat. His shawl, Ruth's shawl. He'd told her to use it when she'd asked, and she'd taken it without making it into anything complicated, which he'd been grateful for. "Thread," she said. "If they have it. The dark brown." "I'm almost out." "I'll look. You don't have to—" "Clara." He buckled the last strap. "Thread. Dark brown." "I wrote it down." She looked at him for a moment in that particular way she had, direct and slightly assessing, reading something in his face that he wasn't sure was there. Then she nodded and went back inside, and he climbed up to the wagon bench and turned the horses toward the road. The drive into Dunmore took 40 minutes on a good day. Today the road was hard-packed ice under an inch of new powder, and he kept the horses at a walk most of the way, which gave him 40 minutes of his own company and his own thoughts, which was not, at this particular point in his life, ideal company or ideal thoughts. He thought about the carving in the drawer. He'd worked on it 4 more times since January started, always at night, always after the cabin was quiet. It was finished, had been finished for a week. The petals had that particular curl to them, the grain of the wood visible in the right light in a way that made it look like something alive. He'd smoothed it until it was warm to the touch. He knew it was done. He kept putting it back in the drawer. He was 40 minutes into that thought, or some version of it, when he pulled up outside the general store in Dunmore and climbed down and went inside to where it was warm and smelled like tobacco and dry goods and the particular dusty wood smell of a store that had been in the same building for 20 years. Tom Dunmore was behind the counter. 62, mostly deaf in one ear, kept the best inventory between here and Cheyenne and would not make small talk under any circumstances, which Caleb had always appreciated. "Rourke," Tom said. "Tom." He handed over the list. Tom read it without expression, turned, began pulling things from shelves with the efficiency of a man who'd memorized every inch of his own store. Caleb stood at the counter and let his eyes move across the room and tried not to think about anything for 5 minutes. He almost made it. The door opened, bringing cold air, and Margaret Holloway, which were, in Caleb's experience, roughly equivalent in terms of their effect on a room. She was with two women he recognized: Eleanor Marsh, who was married to the man who ran the feed operation on the south side of town, and a woman named Petra Voss, whose husband was on the town council and who had apparently inherited her sense of her own importance along with his position. They were mid-conversation when they came in, which meant they didn't notice Caleb immediately, which meant he heard the first part of it before any of them thought to lower their voices. "Saw her at the Halverson place Tuesday," Eleanor was saying. "Dorothy Halverson said she seemed capable enough, but capable." Margaret said the word the way you'd say a word that was technically accurate but missing something essential. "I'm sure she's capable. I'm sure she's very capable of making the most of what she managed to arrange for herself." "Margaret, I'm not being unkind, I'm being factual. A woman arrives with nothing. Nothing, Eleanor. A carpet bag and a dress that should have been retired 2 winters ago. And within a month, she's settled into a respectable man's home with his daughter and his property, and she's his wife," Petra said, though she didn't say it like an argument, more like a complicating detail she felt obligated to include. "She's what the paperwork says she is," Margaret said. "That's not the same thing. A man like Caleb Rourke doesn't need to be sending away for desperate women from Missouri who have nothing to offer except—" Caleb had been very still during this. The kind of still that is actually the opposite of stillness. That is a person making a deliberate and effortful decision to remain in one place. Tom Dunmore, who was deaf in one ear, looked up from the counter and looked at Caleb, and then looked at the women near the door, and his expression, which was normally as readable as a post, shifted about 1 degree in a direction that might have been sympathy. Margaret saw Caleb. There was a pause, brief but real. The kind of pause that happens when a person runs the calculation of how much they've already said, and whether there's any version of this that recovers cleanly. "Caleb," she said. Her voice was the same. That was the thing about Margaret. She never actually apologized for what she said. She simply continued. "Margaret." He kept his voice even. Something in his chest was doing something irregular, some combination of cold fury and something that might have been shame, though the shame wasn't his and he knew that, and knowing it didn't help. "Eleanor, Mrs. Voss." "We were just talking about your—" Eleanor started. "I know what you were talking about." The store got quiet in the way that small-town stores get quiet when something is happening that everyone present is going to report later. Tom Dunmore studied his counter. Caleb picked up his list. He looked at it. He thought about what he should say. He thought about Clara at the cabin door this morning with the wool shawl, and the request for thread said so practically, so without any of the things she had every right to ask for. He thought about Elsie's coat buttoned straight every morning for 3 weeks. He thought about bread and a ceramic cup and a woman who'd packed books when she had nothing left to pack. He thought about all of that, and he opened his mouth and he said, "I need to get back before dark." And then he paid Tom Dunmore for the supplies, accepted the thread, dark brown, Tom had found it without being asked, and walked out. He loaded the wagon, he climbed up, he turned the horses toward home. He drove for 10 minutes before he allowed himself to think about what he'd just done, or more precisely what he hadn't done, and the thought arrived fully formed and ugly. You stood there and you let them. He hadn't agreed with them. He hadn't said anything cruel, hadn't nodded along, hadn't laughed. He'd simply left, taken his supplies and gotten out of a room where those things were being said about his wife and come home to what? To what exactly? To a woman who'd asked for thread and hadn't asked for anything else. He told himself it wasn't his job to manage the opinions of women in a general store. He told himself Clara didn't need him defending her to people whose opinions didn't matter. He told himself a lot of things on the 40-minute drive back through the cold. None of them sat right. He pulled up to the cabin and unloaded the supplies and brought everything in and set it on the table, and Clara looked at what he'd brought and said thank you, and didn't ask how the drive went, probably because something in his face was telling her not to. And he went back out to the barn for longer than the horses required and stood in the cold and the animal warmth and tried to figure out why he felt like he'd done something wrong by doing nothing. The problem was that he knew why. He just didn't want to say it to himself because saying it meant looking at something he'd been not looking at for 3 weeks, which was that he cared what happened to Clara. Not in the abstract, not in the practical sense of a man managing a household, cared specifically about this specific woman who had arrived in a patched coat with a bag full of books and had fixed his daughter's buttons and sat with him at a kitchen table at night and said I went in and made breakfast in a voice that understood exactly what that sentence weighed. He'd stood in that store and said nothing because saying something would have meant claiming her publicly, and claiming her publicly meant he had feelings about this that went past practical, and having feelings that went past practical meant what, exactly? Meant he was alive. Meant 2 years of managing his own grief had not actually finished him. Meant the walls he'd built, carefully, after Ruth, were not as solid as he'd believed. He came inside for supper and sat at the table and ate what Clara had made. Salt pork and the last of the dried beans stretched with some rice she'd found at the back of the pantry. And Elsie talked about a word she'd learned that day, phosphorescence, which Clara had apparently explained involved light coming from living things, which Elsie found extraordinary and philosophically significant in ways she couldn't quite articulate but kept trying to. So things can make their own light? Elsie said. Some things, Clara said. Can people? Clara considered this with the same seriousness she brought to most of Elsie's questions. Not the same way, but maybe something like it. Elsie thought about this through 2 more bites of salt pork. I think Papa could, she announced. When he smiles. He doesn't smile a lot, but when he does, it's like… She gestured broadly and imprecisely with her fork. Like that. Caleb looked at his plate. Clara looked at her plate. Elsie seemed unaware that she'd done anything other than make an accurate observation, and went back to her beans. Later, when Elsie was asleep, and Clara was at the table with her book, and Caleb was at the stove doing nothing in particular, pretending to check the firebox, he said, without planning to say it, I ran into Margaret Holloway today. Clara turned a page. How was that? You know who she is? I know who she is. He turned from the stove and looked at her. She was still looking at the book, but she wasn't reading it anymore. He could tell by the way her eyes had stopped moving. She was talking about you, he said, in the store. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she set the book down, flat on the table, her thumb marking the page, which told him she wanted to return to it, that she was not going to let this become more than it was. I know the kind of things she says. Her voice was neutral. Dorothy Halverson told me back in January, when Elsie and I went to collect that bolt of fabric. He stared at her. You knew. I knew there was talk. She looked at him now. There's always talk, Caleb. Women who arrive the way I arrived. People make stories out of what they don't know. I can't stop that. I should have… He stopped. She watched him stop. She watched him look at the floor, and then the wall, and then back at her, and he could see her making some decision about how hard to push this, whether to push it at all. You should have what? She said finally. Quiet. Not accusing, just asking. Said something. He said it to the floor, instead of just leaving. The fire in the stove snapped once, loudly, like punctuation. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face. Not hurt, or not only hurt, but something more complicated. Disappointment and understanding mixed together the way feelings actually mix, which is not cleanly. All right, she said. That's it? All right? What would you like me to say? She wasn't being cold. He was beginning to understand, exactly as honest as she always was. I can't be angry at you for not doing something I never asked you to do. You didn't agree with them. You left. That's… She paused. That's something. It's not enough. She looked at him steadily. No, she said. It's not. He sat down across from her at the table. Not because he had anything useful to add, just because standing felt wrong. He put his hands on the table the way he'd put them there weeks ago on the night they'd talked about her father and Ruth and 2 years in breakfast, and he looked at his hands and said, I'm going to do better. Clara did not say okay, or I know you will, or any of the things a person says when they're being gracious about accepting an apology that hasn't quite happened yet. She picked up her book and found her page and said, The thread was the right brown. Thank you. He sat there another minute. Then he went up to the loft and lay in the dark and did not sleep for a very long time, turning over the specific feeling of standing in Tom Dunmore's store while Margaret Holloway said what she said, and the specific cowardice of a man who'd stood there and thought about feelings instead of opening his mouth. He was better than that. He wanted to be better than that. The next 2 weeks were different, not dramatically different. Life on a Wyoming homestead in January did not admit drama in the theatrical sense because it was too busy being difficult in practical ways. The water trough, the horses, the fence line, the wood supply that needed constant tending. But something had shifted in the texture of things, in the way Caleb moved through the cabin and around Clara and around the fact of what he'd done and not done. He started talking to her more, about actual things, the state of the south pasture, what he was thinking about the horses come spring, whether it was worth trying to plant anything east of the cabin that hadn't been worked before. She had opinions. He hadn't expected that, though he wasn't sure why he hadn't. She'd taught school and run a household and managed debt and built a life twice over, and he'd somehow failed to extrapolate from those facts that she would have thoughts about cattle rotation. She did. Good ones, some of them. "You've never farmed," he said one afternoon. "No, but I've read about it, and I've listened to farmers talk about it since I was a girl." She was mending. She was always mending something, working through a systematic repair of everything in the cabin that needed it, which was considerable. "I'm not going to tell you how to do your work. I'm just saying what I think when you ask." "I'm asking." "I know." She bit off a thread. "I noticed." There was something in the way she said that. Not warm exactly, but not distant either. Something in the middle. Like a person who has been carefully not reaching for something because they're not sure it's available, and has started, very slowly, to reconsider. Elsie noticed everything, as she always did. She didn't say anything about it directly. Elsie's direct commentary had an instinctive sense of timing, deployed with 6-year-old precision at the moments most likely to hit. But she started doing things. Setting the table with 3 places arranged more closely than usual. Asking Clara to sit on the bench instead of the chair, which put Clara closer to Caleb at the head of the table. Falling asleep, with suspicious convenience, in the middle of evenings when all 3 of them were in the main room, so that Caleb and Clara were left alone at the table or the stove in the quiet. Clara caught on before Caleb did. He watched her figure it out one evening, the exact moment it occurred to her what Elsie was engineering, and he watched her make the decision not to say anything about it, just to let it be, which was, he thought, both very kind and probably very wise. One night in late January, with a storm coming that they'd been watching build all day in the sky to the northwest, Caleb went to the drawer. He stood there with the drawer open for a while. Then he took the carving out and held it in the lamplight and looked at it. He turned it once, looked at the curl of the petals, the grain that ran through them, the center he'd spent more time on than anything, the small, careful cluster that made it look not like a generic flower, but like a specific one, something you'd recognize if you'd seen it growing wild. He closed his hand around it and walked to where Clara was sitting at the table with her book and her lamp. He set it down in front of her. She looked at it. Then she picked it up, the way she'd picked up Elsie's mittens weeks ago. Not carelessly, but not making a ceremony of it either. She turned it in her fingers, looked at the petals, the grain, the center. She turned it over and looked at the back of it, where he hadn't smoothed quite as much, and the tool marks were still visible if you looked. "You made this," she said. "Yes." "When?" "When?" "Started in October." He sat down across from her. "Finished it a while ago." She looked at him. "Why did you wait?" He considered the honest answer, which was several things, and chose the one that was most true. "I wasn't sure what I was saying by giving it." She looked at the flower again. "What are you saying?" He put his hand flat on the table. Old habit. "That I see you," he said. "What you've done here, what you are. I see it, and I should have said it sooner, and I should have said it in that store instead of coming home and saying nothing." Clara set the flower down on the table between them. She looked at it sitting there. The storm outside was arriving now. He could hear it in the change of pitch in the wind, the way the cabin walls creaked once, responding. "Caleb," she said quietly. "I know we started this as a practical arrangement," he said, before he lost the sentence. "I know that's what it was, and that's what we agreed to, and I'm not going to make this into something that puts you in a position you didn't ask for. But I need you to know that it's not—" He stopped. "It hasn't been just practical. For a while now. For me." The storm hit the north wall of the cabin with a sound like a hand laid flat on a drum. The lamp flame bent and recovered. Clara looked at the flower on the table. She touched one of the petals with the tip of her finger. Light, specific. She pressed nothing. Just touched it, the way you'd touch something you're not sure is real yet and need to verify. "I came here," she said slowly, Because I needed a place to build something. That's what I told myself. She didn't look up from the flower. I didn't let myself think past that. I've spent a lot of time the last 2 years not thinking past what's directly in front of me. Because the further out you think, the more there is to lose. I know. I know you know. She looked up now. Her face in the lamplight was not soft exactly. Clara's face was rarely soft. It was too honest for that. But open. More open than he'd seen it. That's the thing, isn't it? You do know. The wind outside moved around the cabin like something alive and looking for a way in. It didn't find one. The walls held. Yeah, Caleb said. She picked up the flower and held it in both hands for a moment. Then she set it carefully beside her lamp, where she could see it from her reading chair. It's a good flower, she said. It's the best I could do. That's enough, she said. And she said it the way she said things that mattered, simply, without decoration, meaning exactly what she said. He went to bed that night with the storm pressing against the cabin and the sound of it in the walls, and some unfamiliar quality in his chest that took him a while to identify, and finally did. He felt lighter. Not happy, not that uncomplicated, just lighter, as if something had been put down that he'd been carrying for longer than he'd known. What he didn't know, because he was in the loft and couldn't see it, was that downstairs Clara had put her book away early. She lay on the pallet near the stove with the small carved flower where she could see it in the last of the firelight, and she was looking at it with an expression that nobody was there to observe, which was the only reason it was entirely honest. She thought about what he'd said. I see you. 3 words that were doing something to her that she'd told herself she wasn't available to have done to her. She thought about Jefferson City and a school board that had used the word liability, and a house that had been sold piece by piece, and a life that had been smaller every month for 2 years. She thought about arriving in the snow with nothing that mattered to anyone in this town, and standing in the cold with her chin up because there was nothing else left to do with it. And she thought about a man who had stood in a store and said nothing, and then come home and couldn't look at himself for it, and then come to a kitchen table with a carved flower and said, I see you in the voice of someone who understood exactly how much the scene cost. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then she took her hands down and looked at the ceiling and thought practically about tomorrow. The feeding schedule, Elsie's reading lesson, the hem she still needed to finish on the curtain above the east window. But the flower was where she could see it. In the morning, the storm had blown through, leaving the sky the particular empty blue of a cold that has gone as far as it can go. Caleb came down from the loft, and Clara was already at the stove, and he poured his coffee and stood beside the stove. And it was the same as every morning, and it was not the same as any morning before it, and neither of them said anything about that because neither of them needed to. Elsie appeared at her curtain at her exact and reliable time, assessed the kitchen with her usual efficiency, and said, Did the storm break something? No, Caleb said. She looked at him. She looked at Clara. She looked at the small carved flower sitting beside Clara's lamp, which she had not put away. Elsie had seen it on the shelf since October. She'd seen him working on it. She had the noticing apparatus of a person who'd been paying attention to the adults in her life for 2 careful years. She didn't say anything about the flower. She pulled out her chair, sat down, and said, Can we have the apple cinnamon again today? We're almost out of cinnamon, Clara said, but not out. Not quite out. Then yes, Elsie said, with the confidence of someone whose argument has concluded in their favor. Caleb watched Clara serve his daughter breakfast with the ease of someone who had been doing it for 2 years rather than 2 weeks. And he thought about the word home, what it meant, how it worked, whether it was a place you found or a place you built, or a place that some combination of people created together just by deciding, every morning, to stay. The carved flower sat beside the lamp. The apple cinnamon came out of the last of the cinnamon. Elsie ate it with great satisfaction, and neither Caleb nor Clara looked at each other directly, and both of them knew the other was thinking about the same thing, and that knowledge was its own particular kind of warmth in a cold Wyoming morning. It lasted for 11 days. Then Caleb went back into town for the second supply run of January, and this time Eleanor Marsh found him at the post stand outside the store before he even got the horses tied. I want to tell you something, she said, before you hear it another way. He looked at her. Eleanor was not a bad woman. He'd always known that. She was Margaret's companion more than Margaret's ally, a person who went along with things rather than drove them. She looked uncomfortable in the particular way of someone delivering news they didn't ask to be the messenger for. Margaret's been talking, she said, more than before. Since the last time you were in. She pulled her coat tighter. She's saying your wife, Clara. She's saying she came here under false pretenses, that she deceived you about her circumstances. Caleb went very still. She's saying, Eleanor continued, faster now, that a woman who lets a man send for her without disclosing that she has nothing, no money, no family, she's saying that's a form of deception, and she's been saying it to enough people that it's... Eleanor stopped, looked at him with something that might have been apology. I thought you should know, before Sunday, before you bring her to town. He had planned to bring Clara and Elsie to town on Sunday. He'd mentioned it to Clara 2 days ago, and she'd said she'd like that, quietly, in a way that meant she wanted it more than she was letting show. Eleanor, he said. She waited. My wife told me exactly what she had and what she didn't have before she ever got on that stage. He said it evenly, without emphasis, the way you say something that is simply true. In her first letter, the second paragraph. Eleanor blinked. She told you. She told me. Eleanor seemed to be doing some internal reorganization of the story she'd been given. Oh, she said. Yes. He untied the horses. Oh. He drove home thinking about Sunday. He drove home thinking about Clara in her patched dress standing in the snow with her chin up and Margaret Holloway's voice carrying the way it always carried, and 11 days of something building in the cabin that was real and was worth protecting. He drove home and went straight to the barn and stood in the cold for 5 minutes doing nothing. Then he went inside. Clara was at the table with Elsie, working through a reading lesson. A passage from one of Clara's books, something about the migration of birds, Elsie tracking each word with her finger. Clara looked up when he came in. She read something in his face, he could tell, because her hand stilled on the page. Elsie looked up too. Papa, did you know birds fly 10,000 miles sometimes? Some of them, in one trip. I didn't know that, he said. Clara says they do it because they have to, because the place they're in stops being right for them. She considered this. Do you think it's scary, flying that far? I think, Caleb said, looking at Clara over the top of his daughter's head, that the scary part is deciding to go, not the flying. Clara held his gaze. Something in her expression asked a question without words. He answered it the same way. A small, deliberate nod. The kind that means, I'm going to handle this. I'm not going to step aside this time. He didn't tell her what Eleanor had said. Not yet. Not tonight, because tonight was the 11-day thing still, and he wanted one more night of it before Sunday came, and he had to do what he should have done 6 weeks ago in Tom Dunmore's store. But he went to the drawer that evening after Elsie was asleep, and Clara thought he was checking the stove, and he didn't take the flour out. The flour was already where it belonged, beside her lamp. Instead, he stood there with the drawer open and looked at what else was in it. Pushed to the very back, in a small cloth bag he'd put there the fall after Ruth died and not opened since, his mother's ring. A simple band. Not elaborate, not valuable, not the kind of thing Margaret Holloway would have worn to town. The kind of thing a woman wore when she worked hard and meant the wearing of it. He took the bag out and held it and felt the weight of it. Lighter than the flour, lighter than most things that mattered. He put it in his pocket. He closed the drawer. He stood in the quiet kitchen while the stove ticked and the wind moved, and somewhere in the cabin his daughter slept, and the woman he was not going to step aside for again sat reading by her lamp with a carved flower beside it, and he held on to the ring in his pocket like a man who has made up his mind about something and is not going back. Sunday was coming. I was ready for it this time. He didn't sleep well Saturday night. That wasn't new. He hadn't slept cleanly since Ruth died, just managed varying degrees of rest, some nights better than others, most nights involving at least one stretch of lying in the dark, with his eyes open, listening to the cabin settle around him. But Saturday was different. Saturday was the specific sleeplessness of a man who has made a decision and is now living in the hours between making it and carrying it out, which are their own particular kind of long. He lay in the loft and stared at the ceiling and went over it. Not whether to do it, that part was settled, had been settled since he'd put the ring in his pocket 3 days ago and felt the rightness of it in a way that didn't require more analysis. What he went over was the how of it, the words. He had never been a man who was good with words in the spoken form. He could write them well enough. He'd written 5 letters to Clara that had apparently said what he needed to say, but speaking was different. Speaking happened in real time, in front of real people, and there was no second draft. He thought about what Margaret Holloway had been saying, about Clara arriving under false pretenses, deceiving him, taking advantage of a respectable man's good nature. He thought about the people in town who'd heard it and the people who'd believe it because it was the kind of story that had a clean shape, a familiar shape, the desperate woman, the naive man, the cautionary tale. Clean stories were easy to believe. They didn't require you to know anything about the actual people involved. He thought about what he knew about the actual people involved. He knew that Clara had disclosed her circumstances in the second paragraph of her first letter, plainly and without apology, before he'd had any occasion to ask. He knew that she'd packed books when she had nothing left worth packing because she understood that what you carried in your mind was the only thing that couldn't be taken. He knew that she'd fixed Elsie's coat and taught her to read and found the ceramic cup when it rolled behind the almanac and sat with a 6-year-old in the dark while she cried without making it about anything other than what it was. He knew that she'd touched the carved flower with the tip of one finger, the way you touch something you're not sure you're allowed to have. He knew all of that, and none of it was the story Margaret Holloway was telling, and Sunday was coming and he was done saying nothing about it. He was up before 4. He came down from the loft in the dark, moving quiet, and found the kitchen empty. Clara still on the pallet, asleep, which was unusual. She was almost always up first. He stood in the dark kitchen and looked at her for a moment. She was on her side, one hand under her cheek, the wool shawl pulled up to her shoulder, the carved flower on the floor beside the lamp where she'd put it, close enough to see from where she lay. He made the coffee and built the fire up and went out to do the morning feeding and came back inside, and by then she was awake, sitting up on the pallet with her hair loose. He'd never seen her hair loose before. She always had it pinned before he came down. And she looked up at him with the expression of someone who's been caught at something, though she hadn't been doing anything wrong, just existing in an unguarded state that the morning had not yet required her to manage. "Sorry," she said, reaching for her pins. "I overslept." "Don't." He went to the stove. "There's coffee." She looked at him. He kept his back to her while she fixed her hair, giving her the privacy of it, and poured her a cup and set it on the table. And when she came and sat down, her hair was up and she was Clara again. The version of Clara that faced the world, which was the version he knew. But he'd seen for 30 seconds the other version, and it was still there, underneath. A woman who was tired sometimes and slept past dawn sometimes, and had not, in 2 months of trying, actually stopped being human. "Today," he said, sitting across from her. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "Today. I want you to wear what you want to wear." He said it carefully. "Not for them, not for me. What you would choose." She looked at him steadily. "I was going to wear the patched dress." He nodded. "That doesn't bother you?" "No." She seemed to be checking something in his face, looking for the thing underneath the thing, which was what Clara did, what she'd always done. She didn't take things at face value, she checked. He didn't mind. It was one of the things he'd come to understand was actually her being respectful, treating people as complex enough to look at twice. Whatever she found in his face, she accepted it. "All right," she said. They ate breakfast when Elsie woke up. Elsie arrived at the kitchen table already dressed, which was unusual, and her hair was braided, which she never did herself because it required 2 hands and a mirror and patience, none of which she had in abundance in the morning. Clara looked at the braids. "You did those yourself?" Elsie sat very straight. "I practiced on the horse." "The horse," Caleb said. "Her tail. It's a similar concept." She picked up her fork with the dignity of someone who will not be questioned on their methods. "I wanted to look right today." Caleb looked at his daughter, this small, serious person who had been navigating an adult world for 2 years with the tools a 6-year-old had available, who had decided on her own that today mattered, and had braided her own hair on a horse's tail in preparation. He felt something move through him that he couldn't have put a word to if you'd asked him, something large and quiet and very old. "You look right," Clara said. Certain, no performance to it, just confirming a fact. Elsie allowed herself a small, satisfied nod and ate her breakfast. The drive to town was cold but clear, the sky the kind of high blue that only happened in deep winter, everything under it sharp-edged and very still. The horses moved at a good pace on the hardpack, and Elsie sat between them on the bench and recited, unprompted, every fact she knew about bird migration, some of which were accurate and some of which had clearly evolved in her mind over the previous week into something larger and more dramatic than the source material. Some birds, she announced, fly so far that when they land they have to remember how to walk. That's not quite, Clara started. It might be true, Elsie said. You don't know. I do know, actually. You know what you've read. The birds might do other things that nobody wrote down. Clara looked at Caleb over the top of Elsie's head. He kept his eyes on the road, but his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile and was not quite not a smile, and Clara looked forward again and Elsie continued her ornithological theories with full confidence. Dunmore came into view, the white rooftops, the smoke from chimneys, the road that widened slightly when it hit the edge of town. Sunday morning, which meant people were out. Not the weekday traffic of errands, but the slower movement of people with time, neighbors stopping to talk, children released from the cabin, a few horses tied outside the buildings. Caleb felt Clara's posture change beside him. She didn't stiffen. It wasn't stiffening. It was more like settling, the way she did when she was preparing for something. He'd seen it before, the morning after their conversation about the store, the day she'd gone with Elsie to the Halverson place. Anytime she was about to walk into a situation that required her to carry herself a particular way. He brought the wagon to a stop near the post stand, climbed down, came around and held up his hand to Clara. She took it and stepped down, and he kept hold of her hand for a moment after she was standing, just a moment, deliberate. She looked at him. He looked at her. Then Elsie jumped down on her own from the other side, landing in the snow with a sound of mild impact and immediate recovery, and the three of them turned toward the street. Margaret Holloway was not there yet. That was all right. He hadn't come for Margaret Holloway specifically. He'd come for what needed doing regardless of whether she was watching. Frank Alderman was the first person they encountered, 60s, had run the feed operation on the south end of town for 30 years, knew Caleb's father, knew Caleb, knew everyone in this county the way men of that age who'd stayed in one place tended to know everyone. He was coming out of the post office with a letter in his hand, and he stopped when he saw them. Caleb said, "Frank." Frank looked at him, looked at Clara, looked at Elsie, who looked back at him with the same steady attention she gave everything, looked back at Caleb. "This your wife?" Frank said. "Yes." Caleb said it the way you say something that has no complication in it, no qualification, just the fact. "Clara. She's been at the homestead since Christmas Eve." Frank looked at Clara the way old men looked at people when they were making up their minds. Direct, somewhat rude, entirely honest. "You're the teacher," he said, "from Missouri." "I was," Clara said. "Yes." "My daughter taught school for a year," Frank said, "before she married. Hard work." "It is," Clara said. Frank nodded once, the way he might nod at something he'd assessed and found acceptable. "Good to meet you," he said to Clara, and then to Caleb. "That east pasture still giving you trouble?" "Every winter," Caleb said. "Try moving the line," Frank said, and walked on, stuffing the letter in his coat. That was Frank Alderman. Practical, brief, and done. Caleb felt something in his chest that was not quite relief, and not quite anything else. More like the first confirmation that what he was doing was possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. They walked further into town. He kept Clara beside him, not making a performance of it, not doing anything theatrical, just walking next to her the way a man walks next to his wife, which was to say normally, because that was what she was. Elsie walked on Clara's other side, which she had apparently decided was the correct formation, and held Clara's hand, which she'd started doing sometime in the last 2 weeks with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who'd decided this was simply where her hand went. Margaret Holloway appeared from around the side of the general store. She had Petra Voss with her and a woman Caleb didn't know well, and they stopped on the walkway when they saw the three of them coming up the street. He watched Margaret's face go through something, a quick calculation, a decision, and then that particular settling into performance that meant she'd decided to hold her ground. He didn't stop walking. He brought them all the way to where Margaret and Petra stood, and he stopped there and said with complete evenness, "Margaret, Petra." "Caleb," Margaret said. Her eyes moved to Clara, moved to Elsie's hand and Clara's hand, moved back to Caleb. "Good morning." My wife, Caleb said. And then, before anything else could happen, he continued. Not loud, not confrontational, just clear, the way you speak when you want to be heard and understood, and you are not going to say it twice. I know you've been talking around town about how she came to be here. I know what you've been saying. He watched Margaret's chin come up slightly. He kept going. Clara told me her circumstances before she agreed to come. First letter she wrote me. She was honest about what she had and what she didn't, which is more than most people manage when they're asking something of someone they've never met. Margaret's mouth opened. She's been on that homestead since Christmas Eve, Caleb said. Working, teaching my daughter, managing everything that needs managing through the hardest part of a Wyoming winter with no complaints that I've heard. He paused. I know what this town sees when it looks at her coat. I know what it thinks that means. I'm telling you plainly, in case it's useful to you, that you're wrong about what it means. He had prepared for this moment. He'd gone over it in the loft on Saturday night, moved the words around, tried to find the version that said the true thing without saying more than he had standing to say. But standing here now, with Clara beside him and Elsie's hand in hers, and Margaret's face doing what it was doing, he understood that no amount of preparation made this easy. His heart was going at a rate that was entirely disproportionate to a conversation on a winter street, and his voice had stayed steady through an act of will that he was currently not acknowledging. Margaret said, I'm sure I never meant... Margaret. He said it quiet. Don't. She stopped. Petra Voss was looking at her feet. The third woman, the one he didn't know, was looking at Clara with an expression that was harder to read, something between reassessment and what might have been, in other circumstances, recognition. Caleb put his hand in his pocket. His fingers found the cloth bag before he'd consciously made the decision, and he took it out and opened it there on the street, in front of Margaret Holloway and Petra Voss and whoever else was within range, and he took out his mother's ring. He turned to Clara. She looked at the ring, then up at him. Something in her face moved. He couldn't name it, couldn't categorize it. It was too fast and too real, and too many things at once. I know we already have the paperwork, he said, quieter now, and this part was only for her. I know that's what makes it legal, but I want you to have this. He held it out. My mother's. She wore it through everything this land threw at them, her and my father, and she never... He stopped, collected himself. I want you to have something that's not just a legal arrangement, something that means I chose this, that I'm choosing this. Clara looked at the ring for a long moment, then she looked at him. In front of all these people, she said. In front of all these people, he said. The ghost of something with a complicated relationship to humor, moved across her face. You could have done this at breakfast, she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, which was the first time he'd heard it not entirely steady, and it undid him in a way that almost nothing else had. I could have, he agreed, but then it would only be true at breakfast. She took the ring. She held it for a moment in her palm, looking at it the way she looked at the carved flower on the first night, checking if it was real. Then she put it on. It fit, not perfectly, slightly loose on the finger, but she closed her hand around it as if to tell it to stay, and then opened her hand and looked at it on her hand and looked up at him. Thank you, she said. Not performed, not dramatic, just true. Elsie, who had been watching all of this with the focused attention of an archivist, said, from somewhere around their elbows, Does this mean you're really married now? We were really married before, Clara said. But now it's more real? Yes, Caleb said. Now it's more real. Elsie seemed satisfied with this. She looked at the ring on Clara's hand with the same serious inspection she gave everything, decided it met her standards, and then looked up at Margaret Holloway with the unmediated directness of a 6-year-old who has drawn her conclusions. She didn't say anything to Margaret. She didn't need to. She simply looked at her for 2 seconds and then turned away, back to the people she'd decided were hers, and that 2-second look contained more judgment than most adults managed in full sentences. Margaret Holloway, for possibly the first time in her adult life, had nothing to say. It was Frank Alderman who spoke first, from where he'd apparently circled back. Caleb hadn't seen him come back, but there he was, standing at the edge of the street with his hands in his coat pockets. Cold morning to be standing around, he said pleasantly, to no one in particular. Mrs. Rourke. He tipped his hat to Clara and walked on. It was a small thing. It was the right thing. It was the kind of small right thing that changes the temperature of a public moment. And Caleb saw Petra Voss watching Frank Alderman walk away and doing some internal recalculation, and he watched the third woman take a small step back from Margaret, which was its own form of statement. Margaret Holloway put her chin up and walked into the general store. Caleb watched her go. He felt not victorious, that was the wrong word. More like the feeling after a fence post finally seats right, when you've been fighting it across 2 seasons and you drive it in and stamp the ground down and it's solid. No drama in it, just done. "Papa," Elsie said, tugging at his sleeve. "What?" "Can we go see if Tom Dunmore has any of those hard candies? The lemon ones." He looked down at her. "That's what you're thinking about right now?" "I've been thinking about it since we left the cabin," she said with great dignity. "That's been my whole morning." Clara made a sound that was not quite a laugh and definitely was. Caleb looked at her, at the ring on her hand and the patched coat and the expression on her face that was more open than he'd seen it on any morning since Christmas Eve. And he felt something settle in him the way the fence post had settled, heavy and final and good. "Lemon candies," he said. "Yes, please," Elsie said. They went into Dunmore's. Tom was behind the counter. He looked at the 3 of them and looked at Clara's hand and looked at Caleb with about the same amount of expression he brought to most things, which was minimal, and said, "Rourke." Then after a beat, "Mrs. Rourke." Clara said, "Tom?" like she'd been saying it for years. Tom found the lemon candies without being asked, put 3 on the counter, and charged Caleb for 2, which was as close to a gesture of welcome as Tom Dunmore had probably ever made in his life. They spent an hour in town, not because they had an hour's worth of errands, but because Caleb walked them through it, introduced Clara to the people worth introducing her to, let Elsie run the social circuit of children she knew from the few occasions she got to town, stood beside his wife while she met this part of the world she'd married into. Some people were warm. Some were polite in the careful way of people who haven't fully made up their minds. One woman, whose name Caleb had to search for, Martha Birch, she ran the boarding house on the north side, shook Clara's hand and said, "We could use a woman who teaches, out here. My youngest can barely read and he's 9. Clara said she'd be glad to help any time. Martha Birch nodded like they'd made a deal. None of it was easy in the way that easy things were easy. Clara was doing something with her face through all of it, managing, holding, wearing the particular expression of a person who has had to represent themselves to rooms of people who'd already made up their minds about them and has learned to do it without letting that work show. He caught her in a moment between introductions, between one conversation ending and the next beginning, when she was looking at the ring on her hand and her face went briefly somewhere private, not unhappy, not exactly, but somewhere underneath the surface, processing something she wasn't ready to say out loud. He said very quietly, just to her, "All right?" She looked up. "Yes." Then after a second, "It's a lot. I know. I didn't expect—" She stopped, looked at the ring again. "I didn't let myself expect." "I know that too," he said. She looked at him, and he understood, in the way you sometimes understand things without being able to explain the mechanism of it, that this was the moment that mattered more than the public declaration, more than the ring, more than any of it. Just this. Standing in the middle of a Wyoming town on a Sunday morning, 2 people who had both spent 2 years learning how to want nothing, because wanting things that went away was the specific kind of pain that didn't stop, saying to each other that maybe something was available here that they could reach for without bracing immediately for the loss. He reached over and briefly closed his hand over hers, the hand with the ring, and then let go. And they went to collect Elsie from wherever she'd gotten to, which turned out to be a conversation with Frank Alderman's grandson about the structural integrity of snow houses, which she had opinions about, on the drive home. Elsie fell asleep against Clara's arm before they'd gone 2 miles, the way children fall asleep in moving vehicles, completely, without warning, between one moment and the next. Clara held her position without moving so Elsie could stay leaned against her, and Caleb drove, and they rode in a silence that was different from all the previous silences. Not the silence of strangers managing distance, not the silence of people being careful, but just silence. The ordinary silence of people who are comfortable. After a while, Clara said quietly, not to wake Elsie, "I want to tell you something. About Missouri. He waited. I had a man who wanted to marry me. Before all of it. Before my father died. She looked at the road ahead, keeping her voice low and even. He was from a good family, nice enough. He withdrew when my father's debts came out. Not immediately. He waited about 3 weeks, which I suppose he thought was respectful. She paused. After that I thought maybe the lesson was to want smaller, to need less, to not hand people the ability to… She stopped. To not be in a position where what I was worth to someone depended on what I had. He was quiet for a moment. And then you answered a letter from a Wyoming rancher who said no pretenses. And then I answered a letter from a Wyoming rancher who said no pretenses. She looked down at Elsie asleep against her arm. I thought it was safer, a practical arrangement. She made a small sound, not quite a laugh. Less to lose. He thought about that. Thought about his own version of the same calculation. The specific way grief had taught him to manage down his own expectations, to be useful and functional, and to not reach for anything that could be taken. Two people who'd both learned to want smaller, who'd found each other in the space that smaller left. I'm sorry about the man in Missouri, he said. Don't be. He did me a favor. She looked at the ring on her hand. I wouldn't be here otherwise. He thought about that too. No, he said. Neither of us would be. The homestead came into view. The cabin low against the white land, smoke from the chimney, the fence line he'd repaired and would repair again, the barn, the water trough, the east field that was still frozen and would thaw eventually. All of it exactly as he'd left it this morning, and all of it different in the way that things sometimes become different without anything visible changing. He pulled up and tied the horses and lifted Elsie from the wagon without waking her. She was deeply, completely asleep, entirely trusting, the way children trusted adults who had proven they were going to catch them. He carried her inside and laid her on her bed and pulled the curtain. When he came back to the kitchen, Clara was at the stove already, her coat hung up, the ring visible on her hand as she moved. She was heating something left from yesterday, adding to it, her attention on the task. The carved flower was where she'd put it 3 weeks ago, beside the lamp. He took his coat off, hung it, stood in his kitchen. I was thinking, he said, about the East Room. I said I'd build it. Before winter ends is too ambitious, but early spring, the East Room can wait, Clara said, without turning around. You've been on that pallet for 2 months. I've slept in worse places for worse reasons. She turned then, looked at him with that direct expression. Build the room when the ground thaws and the lumber's workable. Don't rush it. He stood there. Clara, she looked at him. I'm glad you answered the letter, he said. He said it simply, without construction, the way he said things that he needed to say before he could talk himself out of them. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove, but not before he saw what her face did. That brief, unguarded thing, the version of her he'd seen for 30 seconds that morning with her hair loose, the one underneath that did not manage anything. So am I, she said. To the stove, to the pot, to the kitchen. Most days, he repeated. You're not perfect either, she said, and there was the dry humor, the thing that caught him off guard every time. No, he said. I'm really not. She made a sound that was laughter, small and real, and he stood in his kitchen in the late afternoon light and let it land. Elsie slept through supper, which had never happened before in recorded history, and so they ate alone at the kitchen table, just the two of them, which had also never happened before without Elsie between them as both buffer and bridge. They ate and talked about practical things, and then impractical things, and then nothing at all for a while. And the ring was on her hand across the table, and the carved flower was by the lamp, and the fire was good. He thought once about Margaret Holloway, and the thought passed through without snagging, the way thoughts about things that were finished sometimes did. He thought more about the ring and Clara's face when she'd looked at it in her palm, checking if it was real. He thought about a woman who'd packed books when she had nothing left to pack, and a man who'd sat in a barn for 2 days and then went inside to make breakfast, and a 6-year-old who braided her own hair on a horse's tail because she wanted to look right. He thought about how a family was not a thing you found. It was a thing that happened, quietly, in kitchens and barns and wagon benches and pallet beds near the stove, in thread and carved wood and arithmetic problems and ceramic cups and bread and lemon candy and 2 seconds of a child's unsparing look and a ring on a hand on a cold Wyoming morning. Clara cleared the dishes. He dried them, which was not something he'd done before, and she didn't comment on it, and he didn't explain it, and they did the dishes together in the kitchen while Elsie slept behind her curtain and the fire made the sounds fires make when they're doing their job. And outside the Wyoming winter sat on the land the way it always did, heavy, uncertain, and completely indifferent to the small, warm things happening inside. The small, warm things kept happening anyway. He was beginning to understand, the whole point. February came in mean and stayed that way. There was a week in the middle of the month where the temperature dropped to something that stopped being a number and became simply a condition, a state of the world that the body registered not as cold, but as hostility, as the land's flat refusal to accommodate anything soft or living. The horses needed checking twice a day. The water trough froze through overnight regardless of what Caleb did to prevent it. The cabin's east wall, the one that faced the prevailing wind, developed a draft along the bottom corner that Clara found one morning and stopped with strips of cloth soaked in tallow, a solution that was ugly and effective, which she seemed to consider a perfectly acceptable category of solution. Caleb watched her do it without offering to help, not because he didn't want to help, but because she was already finished by the time he understood what she was doing. She had that quality. She assessed a problem and moved on it before most people had fully named the problem to themselves. He'd seen it with the button tin, with the arithmetic lesson, with Elsie's crying in the dark. She didn't require the dramatic pause that problems sometimes demanded. She just fixed the thing and moved to the next thing. He told her that once, obliquely. She said, "Hesitating never made a cold wall warmer." He thought about that for 3 days. The East Room had become a genuine project now. He'd started framing it in the last week of January, working on it in whatever daylight hours the other work allowed, which was not many. The lumber he had was mostly sound. He'd put some aside 2 autumns ago for a project he'd never gotten around to starting, back when he'd still been in the phase of making plans and abandoning them, because plans required a future, and he hadn't been entirely sure he believed in one. That lumber had sat under a canvas in the barn through 2 winters and it was still good, which was either luck or the particular stubbornness of materials that had nowhere else to be. Clara came to look at the framing one afternoon, standing in the cold with her arms crossed and her coat on and her breath making clouds. She looked at what he'd done. The post set, the rough framing of 2 walls, the outline of a space that would eventually be a room, and she looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "It'll be tight," he said, "but there's room for a proper bed. Window on the east wall if the lumber holds." "It'll hold," she said. "You don't know that." "The barn's still standing," she said. "You built that." He looked at the framing. It was not his best work. The light was wrong half the time, and his hands had been too cold on 2 of the days he'd worked on it, and one of the posts was about a 1/4 inch off. True in a way that would only matter aesthetically, not structurally, but that he noticed every time he looked at it. "It'll be done before the thaw," he said. "I know it will." She said it the same way she said most things she was certain of, simply, without ornament, like a person who doesn't feel the need to perform conviction because the conviction is just there. "I'm not worried about the room, Caleb." He looked at her. "I know it's for me," she said. "I know that's the point of it. I want you to know that I understand what you're doing, and I'm grateful." She paused. "I just don't want you to think I've been miserable on the pallet. I haven't been. This has been the first place in 2 years where I've gone to sleep and not immediately started calculating what I was going to have to give up next." He had nothing to say to that. He put it somewhere and kept it. She went back inside. He stood at the framing and looked at the 1/4 inch post and then looked at the space and tried to see what it would be. A room with a window, a room for sleeping in without calculating what came next. A room that said to a person that they were staying, that the staying was real and worth building toward. He went back to work. March arrived the way March arrived in Wyoming, which was to say it arrived like a man who'd promised to come and kept most of the promise, but not all of it. The worst of the cold broke in the first week. Not warmth, not yet, but a different quality to the cold, a loosening at the edges that suggested the season was beginning to exhaust itself. The sky went from the flat white gray of deep winter to something with more variation, clouds that moved instead of sitting, light that was in the air longer each day, in increments so small you only noticed them when you looked back across a week and saw the difference. Elsie noticed the light first, as she noticed most things first. "It's staying later," she announced one evening, looking at the window from her reading lesson. Clara said, not looking up from the page they were on. "Last week when we did this, it was dark already." Elsie looked at the window, then at Clara, then at the window again. "Does that mean spring is coming?" "Eventually." "How long is eventually?" "In Wyoming?" Clara glanced at the window herself. "Could be another 6 weeks. Could be 8. The land decides." Elsie considered this. "I want to plant something," she said. It came out with a definiteness that suggested it had been building for a while. "What kind of something?" "Flowers." Then with a brief look at Caleb across the room, as if checking something. "Mama used to have flowers. By the south window," Papa said. Caleb had not said this to Elsie. He'd said it to Clara at the kitchen table weeks ago, the night they talked about 2 years and breakfast. He'd mentioned briefly that Ruth had grown flowers in a tin by the south-facing window, not a garden exactly, just a tin with some seeds she'd ordered from somewhere and tended with the specific attention she gave to things she wanted to keep alive. Clara had apparently, at some point between then and now, mentioned this to Elsie. She had not told him she'd done this. He sat with that for a moment. The fact of it, the deliberateness of it, the understanding that Clara had been thinking about what Elsie needed to know about her mother, and had made a decision about how to give it to her. "Did you know about the flowers?" Elsie asked Clara. "Your father mentioned it," Clara said carefully. "Can we plant some, when the ground's ready?" "We can try," Clara said. "It depends on what seeds we can find and what will grow here." "Could we find seeds in town?" "Tom Dunmore might have some, come April." Clara turned back to the page. "We'll look." Elsie seemed to file this as a confirmed plan and returned to the reading lesson with renewed motivation, as if the flowers had been the thing her attention needed to properly engage with the reading. She got through 2 more pages without losing focus, which was a record. Caleb sat in his chair by the stove and said nothing, and looked at the lamp by the south window where a tin could sit, and at the ring on Clara's hand holding the page, and felt something that was not grief and was not happiness, but was the complicated territory between them where real life mostly happened. The East Room was finished the 3rd week of March. It was not a beautiful room. The window was slightly uneven in its frame, the post that was off true making itself known in the end, and the floor had a gap along the north wall that he'd filled with oakum and would fill again next winter when it opened up again. But it was insulated and solid, and the window faced east so that it got the morning light. And he'd built a proper bed frame that was not elegant but was level and would hold, and he'd put a small shelf on the wall because he'd watched Clara for 3 months and knew she needed a place for things she wanted to see. He put the carved flower on the shelf before he showed it to her. Then he thought about that and moved the flower back into his pocket because it was hers and she should decide where it went. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room for a long time. Then she walked in and stood in the middle of it and looked at the window and the light coming through it and the shelf on the wall and the bed frame and the floor with its filled gap and the ceiling that was not perfectly even. "Caleb," she said, "I know it's not—" "Stop." She turned around. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was feeling more than she was going to put directly into words. That slight compression, the jaw set, the eyes that were too steady to be entirely steady. "It's a room," she said. "A real room. With a window. Slight gap in the floor along the—" "I don't care about the gap. I'll fix it next—" "Caleb." She said his name the way she'd said it in the wagon on Christmas Eve. Not sharp, not impatient, just direct and real. She looked at him across the small room. "Thank you. That's what I'm saying. Thank you." He took the flower out of his pocket and held it out. She took it and looked at it. The same look as the first time, checking, making sure it was real. And then she put it on the shelf. She moved it once, slightly, to find the right place. Then she left it there. He put a bed in the room and she moved off the pallet and began sleeping behind a door for the first time since Jefferson City, and this changed the quality of the mornings in a way that was hard to articulate. Not worse, not better. Different. As if something that had been provisional was now fixed in place, and both of them were adjusting to the particular weight of a thing that had stopped being temporary. There was an argument in late March. The first real one, not a tension or a silence, an actual argument Voices raised enough that Elsie heard it from her alcove and went and sat outside in the cold until it was over, which Caleb did not know until afterward, and which made him feel worse than the argument itself. It was about money, because most arguments in marriages are about money on the surface and about something else underneath. He'd gone to town for supplies and had come back having spent more than the agreed amount, not by much, but by enough. And he hadn't mentioned it when he got home, and she'd found the receipt in his coat pocket 2 days later when she was mending the lining. She brought the receipt to the kitchen table, set it down, said quietly, "We agreed on an amount." He said something dismissive. He didn't mean it to be dismissive. He meant it to be explanatory, but it landed dismissive. She said also quietly, but with the particular quietness that in Clara meant the temperature had dropped, "I'm not asking for an accounting of every cent. I'm asking to be part of the decisions. There is a difference," he said, and he knew while he was saying it that it was wrong, could hear it going wrong as the words came out, but they came out anyway, which was how wrong words worked, that he'd been managing this homestead for a long time before she arrived, and he didn't think one extra expenditure required a committee. The room went to a specific kind of quiet. Clara looked at him across the table. He looked back at her. He watched her process what he'd said, watched her take it apart and look at its pieces and understand what it meant, not just on the surface but underneath, heard himself hear it the same way. Before she arrived. He'd said it. Past tense, drawing a line, accidentally and precisely excluding her from the history and possibly from the present. "I see," she said. Just that. She got up and went to the east room and closed the door. Not hard, not dramatically, just shut it. And he sat at the kitchen table with the receipt and his own words and the particular awfulness of knowing exactly where you went wrong, and that knowing it is not the same as being able to take it back. He sat there for about 20 minutes. Then he got up and went to her door and knocked on it, which was the first time he'd knocked on that door since he'd built it. "Clara." A pause. "Yes." "I said something wrong." Another pause. "You said something you didn't mean to say the way you said it." "No," he said. "I think I said it the way I said it. I just didn't mean to believe it. There's a difference." The door opened. She stood in the doorway of the room he'd built for her, the morning light from the east window behind her, the carved flower on the shelf behind that. She looked at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding something. "I know this land is yours," she said. "I know the history of it is yours, and the work that built it is yours, and that I came into the middle of something that was already made." She said it without accusation. "I don't want to take that from you. I never wanted that." "I know." "What I want," she continued, and he could hear the care in it, the deliberateness of a woman who chose words the way she chose everything, because they mattered and she knew they mattered, is to be inside the decisions, not over them, not instead of you, alongside. She paused. "That's all I want, Caleb. To be alongside." He stood in the hallway of his cabin and looked at her and thought about the word alongside. How small it was. How much it contained. Two people moving in the same direction with the same information at roughly the same speed. Not one leading and one following. Not one managing and one accepting, alongside. "You are," he said. "I want you to be. I got defensive about something that wasn't actually being attacked, and I put you outside of it, and that was wrong. I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment. Then she took one step back into the room and one step to the side, which was an invitation. He went in, sat on the edge of the bed frame. She sat on the other side, facing the east window, her hands in her lap, the ring catching the light. They sat in the room he'd built in the awkward and necessary aftermath of the first genuine argument, which was also an argument about something true and worth having, which was also the kind of argument that survived, made the floor under a thing more solid than it was before. "We're not good at this yet," he said. "No," she agreed. "We've known each other 4 months. 4 months. It takes longer than 4 months," she said, "to know how to fight with someone without accidentally saying the worst version of what you mean." "Is that something you learn?" She turned and looked at him. "I think you have to want to learn it, and you have to be willing to come knock on the door after." She paused. "You came and knocked on the door." He said, "I'll always come knock on the door." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the window and said, "I know. That's why we're sitting here instead of me packing a bag." He thought about that. about the fact that it had not occurred to him as a possibility, and about what it meant that she'd said it, that it was a possibility she'd carried into this room with her and put down, that she had the option and she was choosing not to take it, that choosing was active, daily, an act of will, and not just a fact of circumstance. "I don't want you to pack a bag," he said. The simplest possible version of the thing. "I know," she said again. "I don't want to pack one either." They sat in that room a while longer. It was not comfortable the way comfortable things are easy. It was the other kind of comfort, the kind that costs something, that is purchased with honesty, and staying in the room when the room is uncomfortable and knocking on the door after. That kind of comfort was worth more than the easy kind. He was beginning to understand that it was, in fact, the only kind that lasted. April came. And with April came the first suggestion of actual warmth. Not warmth exactly, but the memory of warmth, the promise of it in the particular way the light hit the south wall of the cabin in the early afternoon and stayed for an hour before giving up. The frozen top of the ground developed a crust you could break through with a boot heel, which meant the lower levels were beginning to move, which meant the world was thawing from the inside out the way worlds did. Caleb noticed the flowers first, which surprised him. He was coming back from checking the south fence line. An April inspection, routine, looking for winter damage before the cattle were moved, when he saw them. Not a field of them, not anything dramatic. 3 of them, low to the ground, pushing up through the broken crust about 20 feet from the south wall of the cabin, in the sheltered angle where the cabin met the barn and cut the wind. Small, purple and gold, petals just opened, looking frankly improbable in the remaining cold. He stopped walking and looked at them for a long time. Ruth had called them by a name he'd never remembered properly. Something from her grandmother, maybe, some family name for a thing that came up every April in this same spot, in this same sheltered angle, year after year in his memory, back to before Ruth, back to his mother's time on this land, though he couldn't have said with certainty if that was true or something he'd constructed around the fact of them. They came. That was what he knew. Every April, somewhere in the second week, they came. He went inside. Clara was at the table with Elsie working through a geography lesson, a map of the territories laid out between them, Elsie's finger moving across it with the proprietary authority she brought to navigation. She looked up when he came in. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, which she read because she read most things. "What?" she said. "Come and see something." She got her coat. Elsie got her coat too, uninvited, because Elsie never considered herself uninvited. They followed him out to the south corner where the cabin met the barn, and he pointed at the ground and they looked at the 3 flowers in the broken crust. Elsie went still. That was unusual enough, Elsie going still, that both Caleb and Clara looked at her. She was looking at the flowers with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. Something that looked, if you were going to try to name it, like recognition. "Those are Mama's flowers," she said. Soft. Not a question. Caleb crouched down to be level with her. "They come up every April," he said. "Same spot. Always have." Elsie looked at the flowers. She crouched down too, close, but not touching, the way she'd been near her mother's cup, respectful of the specific weight of the thing. She looked at them for a long time. Then she sat back on her heels and said, to no one in particular, "She's not gone then. Not all the way." He did not know what to say to that. He was quiet. Beside him, Clara was quiet too. "She's in the cup," Elsie continued, working this out in real time with the unself-conscious seriousness of a child doing genuine philosophy. "And she's in the flowers, and she's in the things I know how to do that you taught me that she taught you." She looked up at Caleb. "Right?" He had to clear his throat before he could speak. "Right," he said. Elsie looked at Clara. She looked at her for a moment with those steady eyes, weighing something. Then she said, "Is that okay? That she's still here?" Clara met her look, and he watched Clara do the thing she was best at, which was not manage the moment or perform the correct emotion for it, but simply be in it, present and honest. "Yes," she said. "She should be here. This is her home too." Elsie considered this carefully. Then she nodded as if a complicated thing had been settled to her satisfaction. She stood up and brushed the cold dirt off her knees and said, "Can we plant more flowers? For spring? Spring, so there are more of them?" "Yes," Clara said. Next to these ones? A little to the side, Clara said. So these have their space. Elsie looked at the existing flowers and then at the space to their left, measuring. Okay, she said. That works. And she walked back toward the cabin, her coat slightly askew, both braids intact because she'd braided them on the horse again this morning and had gotten faster at it. Caleb stayed crouching by the flowers. Clara stood beside him. He looked at the three of them, small and purple and gold and absurdly alive in the cold. And he thought about Ruth, who would have been 32 this year, who had stood in this same spot in April years ago pointing at these same flowers with the exact specific pride of a woman who'd learned to find triumph in small things. He thought about her clearly, fully, without the particular quality of pain that had accompanied the thinking of her for 2 years. Not because the pain was gone, but because it had changed, softened from something acute into something more like the permanent ache of a healed break. There when the weather changed, not debilitating, just present, real, a reminder of something that had been and still was in the ways things remained. He reached out and put his hand next to the flowers without touching them, just near them. She would have liked you, he said. He said it to Clara, not to the flowers. Ruth, she would have... He stopped and tried it again. She liked people who meant what they said, who didn't dress things up. She had no patience for performance. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, I think I would have liked her too. He stood up. They stood beside each other in the April cold and looked at the flowers, and it was one of those moments that doesn't announce itself, doesn't feel important while it's happening, but that you know afterward. You know because of the specific quality of the quiet, the way time moved differently in it, the sense of something being held carefully between people who understood its weight. I want to tell you something, he said. She waited. After Ruth, I thought that was the end of that chapter, of being a person who had something to protect, something to lose. He looked at the flowers. I managed everything down to the minimum, just what was necessary. Elsie, the land, the work. I told myself I was being responsible, realistic. He paused. I think I was just scared. Clara looked at him. I'm still scared, he said. I want to tell you that too. It doesn't go away, but He turned and looked at her, the woman who had arrived in the snow with a carpetbag full of books and a chin at an angle that dared the world to say something about it. I would rather be scared and here than safe and somewhere else. That's what I know right now. That's what I can say. Clara held his gaze. The ring on her hand caught the flat April light. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the wagon on Christmas Eve. Direct, assessing, the reed that went underneath the surface. Then she looked at the flowers. I spent 2 years, she said slowly, making myself need less, trusting less, asking for less. She picked her words like she always did, with care. And I got so good at it that when I answered that letter, I told myself it was practical. I told myself I was being smart, managing my own expectations. She was quiet a moment. I think what I was actually doing was giving myself permission to want something without having to call it wanting, so that if it didn't work, I could say I never really wanted it to begin with. Did it work? He said. She looked at him. No, she said, not even a little. Something in his chest moved away he hadn't felt in 2 years and was not going to try to describe because some things lived below the range of language, in the part of a person that predated words. He just let it move. Clara, he said. I know, she said. I haven't said it. I know. She looked at the flowers. Say it anyway. He was quiet for a moment. He was a man who was not good with spoken words in real time. He knew this about himself. He'd known it for 34 years. But she was standing in April cold beside flowers that came back every year, regardless of how hard the winter had been. And she had just told him that she'd tried not to want this and had failed, and he was done putting things back in drawers. I love you, he said. Plain, without architecture. 3 words that had been true for a while and were going to be true for longer, and all they needed was to be said out loud in the cold beside some flowers by a man who wasn't good at saying things out loud. She turned and looked at him. She did not say it back immediately. That was Clara. She did not do anything immediately that she hadn't already decided to do. She looked at him with the full weight of the thing and let it sit there between them, real and out in the open where she could see it properly. Then she said, "I was trying not to fall in love with you, in case you want to know how that went." He felt his mouth move in a way that was not the not-quite smile of the wagon ride, but the real thing, the one Elsie had tried to describe at the kitchen table. The one that apparently looked like phosphorescence, like something generating its own light. "How did it go?" he said. "Badly," she said. And then she laughed. The real laugh. The one that caught her off guard. The one that meant something had gotten past her defenses, and she was briefly annoyed about it, and then not annoyed about it at all. He had heard this laugh a handful of times in 4 months, and it was still the best sound that Cabin had ever held. He reached over and took her hand, the one with the ring. She let him, which with Clara was never automatic, never just a thing that happened because it was expected. It was always a choice, and the choice was always clear. They stood there a while longer. Then the door opened and Elsie appeared on the step and said, "Are you two just going to stand outside? Because I'm cold and I want to finish the map." Clara called back, 2 minutes. "I'll count," Elsie said, which was not an idle threat. They walked back to the cabin together. Elsie held the door with the patience of someone for whom 2 minutes was a significant commitment, and they went inside to the map and the geography lesson and the kitchen that smelled like the bread Elsie had made this morning with diminishing supervision and increasing confidence, and the lamp by the east window, and the shelf in the east room where the carved flower had lived for 3 weeks. The lesson continued. Elsie moved her finger across the territories with authority. Clara answered questions with the specificity of someone who had actually read about these places and found them interesting. Caleb sat at the far end of the table and pretended to read the almanac, and mostly just sat in the room that had been cold for 2 years, and was warm now in the particular way that warmth meant, which was not only temperature. Later that evening, after Elsie was in bed and the cabin was quiet, Caleb went to the small chest at the back of the loft, the one he hadn't opened since the winter after Ruth died. He'd told Clara about it briefly in one of their late evenings, mentioned it without detail, and then not gone back to it. He opened it now and looked at what was inside. Some of Ruth's things, a handkerchief with embroidery along the edge, a small diary he'd never read and didn't intend to, a folded piece of paper with a pressed flower inside it, a winter flower, the purple and gold kind put there years ago by someone who'd understood that things worth keeping needed to be kept deliberately. He held the pressed flower for a moment. Then he put it back in the paper and put the paper back in the chest and closed it, and sat on the edge of the loft with his hands on his knees and thought about what it meant to love someone you'd lost and love someone who was here, whether those things competed or whether they simply coexisted the way the past and the present coexisted in a house where both were honored, where a ceramic cup and a carved flower occupied the same shelf without either erasing the other. He thought they coexisted. He thought they had to. He thought the man who told himself otherwise, who made grief into a wall instead of a room, who kept the past locked up instead of letting it live alongside the present, that man was poorer for it, and the people who loved him paid the cost. He went downstairs. Clara was at the table with a letter. She'd been writing to someone in Missouri, a woman she'd taught with, an occasional correspondence she'd mentioned briefly. She looked up. "You all right?" she said. "Yes." He sat down across from her. I opened the chest. She set down her pen. "Just looked," he said. "Put it back." He looked at the table. "I wanted to. I thought I should." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good. It didn't—" He stopped. Tried again. "I thought it might feel like losing something. It didn't. It felt like putting something in the right place, where it was supposed to be." He looked up at her. "She's supposed to be in that chest, and in the flowers, and in Elsie." He paused. "And you're supposed to be here. Those aren't the same thing, and they're not in competition. I think I knew that, and I couldn't. It took me a while to feel it." Clara looked at him for a long moment. 4 months, she said. 4 months, he agreed. "You're doing better than you think," she said, and went back to her letter, which was the most Clara thing she could possibly have done. Acknowledged the thing he'd said, given it its due, and moved on without dwelling in it, which was how she treated most things that mattered. She didn't wring them out. She received them and kept them and moved forward. He sat with her in the quiet while she wrote, and he did not read the almanac, and it was enough. It was more than enough. 3 weeks later, on the first morning in April that genuinely felt like spring, not a promise of it, but the actual thing, the air carrying something different, the ground releasing its last grip on the cold. Elsie came out of the cabin before breakfast with a tin she'd found in the barn, which she'd filled with dirt from the south corner and placed on the porch step with 4 seeds in it that Tom Dunmore had produced from somewhere behind his counter, when she'd asked with the focused intentionality she brought to negotiations. Clara looked at the tin on the step. "You planted them," she said. "This morning," Elsie said. "Early, before you were up." She looked at the tin with a farmer's critical assessment. "Is the dirt right?" "We'll see," Clara said. "If it's not right, you can tell me. I can fix it." "It looks fine, Elsie." Elsie seemed to need that confirmed once more. "Really?" "Really?" Elsie nodded. She stood back and looked at the tin, and then at the 3 flowers still pushing up from the south corner of the cabin, which were more open now, fully themselves in the spring light. She stood there for a moment with her hands at her sides and her braids and her coat and her face that was 6 years old and 30 years old at the same time, and she was quiet in a way she was not often quiet. "I want them both grow," she said. Not to either of them in particular, maybe to herself. "The old ones and the new ones, both." "That's the idea," Caleb said. He'd come to the door behind them, coffee in hand, and was leaning in the frame the way he leaned, taking up the doorway the way he took up most spaces. Fully, without apology, a large man who had learned he was allowed to be where he was. Elsie looked at him, then at Clara, then back at the tin with the seeds. "Okay," she said, resolved. "Okay." And she went inside to eat breakfast with the air of someone who has completed an important task and can now attend to the day's other business. Caleb and Clara stood on the porch for a moment. The spring morning around them was doing what spring mornings in Wyoming did when they finally arrived, performing themselves with a fullness that compensated for how long they'd been withheld. The light was different, the air was different, even the sound was different, the particular quality of a world that had stopped clenching against the cold and was finally, carefully opening. The tin with the seeds sat on the step between them. The 3 flowers held their place in the corner where they'd held it for years. Clara reached over and took his hand, which she'd been doing with increasing ease over the last few weeks, the way most things between them had moved from deliberate to natural in increments too small to mark exactly. He closed his hand around hers, the ring warm from her skin, the morning cool around both of them. He thought about the letter he'd written on the 4th attempt, the one that had finally sounded like a reasonable adult human being, no pretenses offered or expected. He thought about the 2nd paragraph of her reply, where she'd told him exactly what she had and what she didn't have because that was how she operated. He thought about a carpetbag full of books, and a child asking a stranger if she was cold, and mittens that only made it to the 2nd knuckle, and arithmetic problems solved from the bottom up, and a fence post finally seated solid, and coffee that was better than his, and the first real argument and the door knocked on afterward, and 3 words said out loud in April cold beside flowers that came back every year. He thought about all of it, the whole unglamorous, uneven, entirely real accumulation of 4 months of 2 imperfect people deciding every day to stay in the same house and mean it. He was not a man given to summaries. He did not generally stand on porches arriving at conclusions. But standing there with the spring morning and the tin with the seeds and Clara's hand in his, he allowed himself to name the thing he was feeling, which was this: gratitude. The real kind, the kind that cost something to earn and was worth what it cost, for the specific accident of a letter answered in a Missouri paper by a woman who'd decided she would rather build something than manage a slow disappearing act. She had built something. They both had. Out of what they'd brought, which was mostly damage and stubbornness and the particular resilience of people who'd been through things and kept going anyway. Not despite that, because of it. The damage was the material. The stubbornness was the tool. And the thing they'd built was not perfect, was not finished, would require maintenance every season the way everything worth keeping did. But it was real, it was solid, and it was theirs. Inside, Elsie was singing something to herself, not a real song, something she'd made up, melodically eccentric in the way of songs invented by 6-year-olds, words about birds and flowers, and something that might have been arithmetic. It came through the walls of the cabin and out into the morning, this small, unpolished sound, and it was the best possible evidence of what 4 months had built in that house. Clara squeezed his hand once, brief and firm, the way she did things she meant without ceremony. He squeezed back. They went inside to make breakfast.